Chapter 51, Competition. The next day Tatsuya woke up early like usual and decided to do his morning training in the garden. As he left the room he met with Sareorg, who also came from his room dressed in a training outfit. He looked at Tatsuya and said, "Good morning, I hope you slept well last night." Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Good morning, and yes, I didn't have any inconvenience while sleeping." Sareorg then looked at Tatsuya from top to bottom and then asked, "You heading somewhere?" Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Yes, I was thinking of doing my morning training like usual." Hearing him, Sareorg smiled and asked, "Then why don't you join me? I was heading OU for training as well." Tatsuya nodded and said, "Lead the way." And both of them moved out of the house. Some hours later Koisha woke up and got refreshed. She went to wake Tatsuya up but didn't find him in his room. She then left to find the others, but they were not present in the mansion as well. She became a bit suspicious and then stopped a maid. The maid was running excitedly but still bowed in respect. Koisha looked at the maid and asked, "Where are the others? Have you seen them?" The maid nodded and said, "Yes, all of them are out in the garden witnessing the match between Sareorg-sama and Tatsuya-sama. Many maids and butlers are there as well cheering them. I was going there as well." Koisha nodded but was thinking, what exactly is going on, and immediately rushed outside. When she came out she noticed a huge crowd consisting of maids, butlers, and the peerage members. She approached them and asked, "What is going on here?" Koriana looked at her and said, "Hey, good morning. As you can see, both of them are having a workout competition right now. That Tatsuya of yours is amazing, push-ups, sit-ups, weights, anything, he beats Sareorg-sama in all of them. Right now they are having a race of 500 laps around the garden and he is still Indiana lead. Geez, just how much stamina does that guy have?" Koisha looked towards the garden and saw a dust cloud following both of them. She looked at them in amazement and said, "Just what exactly happened to him?" Flashback. Tatsuya and Sareorg were simply doing their morning training, but suddenly Sareorg started increasing his pace. Seeing him, Tatsuya also increased his pace. Sareorg looked at him with an intrigued expression and then again increased his pace, and just like that the process continued. Sareorg then looked at Tatsuya while both of them were running at inhuman speeds and asked, "Say Tatsuya, wanna have a competition right now?" Tatsuya looked at him and asked, "What sort of competition?" "Just a training competition, like who can do more sets, laps, or can lift more weights." Tatsuya looked at him for a while and thought, "Usually I would not get involved into these sort of things, but..." He then smiled and thought, "Using my body while putting limiters on it and having this type of competition sound fun." He looked at Sareorg with eagerness and said, "Okay, let's do it." Flashback end. Tatsuya looked at Sareorg and said, "You know, Sareorg, it has been a long time since I used my body this much." Sareorg looked at him and asked, "So how does it feel?" Tatsuya smirked and said, "It feels great." And started running faster. Sareorg looked at him with enthusiasm and said, "Not so fast, I am not done yet." And started catching up to him. Both of them then looked in front and saw Sareorg's knights holding a ribbon marking the finish line and started running faster. The maids and butlers were cheering for both of them as they had placed some bets on them. Tatsuya looked at Sareorg one last time and said, "Meet you at the finish line," and accelerated, making Sareorg left in dust. Tatsuya soon crossed the finish line, making some of the servants cheer loudly while the others looking down dejectedly. Tatsuya soon stopped and sat on the ground. He was completely drenched in sweat and was breathing heavily, but still was feeling very happy right now. He has never experienced such kind of competition since he came to this world, and it was certainly a new experience for him. Suddenly he was covered by a person's shadow and he looked up, only to find Koisha looking at him. She passed him a bottle and asked, "You sure look like you are enjoying yourself here." Tatsuya caught the bottle and drank a large gulp of water from it. He then looked at Koisha and said, "I sure am. Sareorg is formidable. This is the first time someone was able to match my place in workout, though I had limiters on me." Koisha puffed her chest and said proudly, "Of course, what else would you expect from my master?" Tatsuya then stood up and gave the bottle back to her and said, "Thank you for that," and smiled at her, making her mesmerized. But she was soon brought out of her stupor when Sareorg came and put his hand around Tatsuya's neck and said, "That was a great match, you sure are great. It only makes me want to fight you right now," and moved his fist forward. Tatsuya fist bumped with him and said, "Yeah, I enjoyed as well, but we have to postpone it for now. We still have to visit your mom, remember?" Sarai sighed and said, yeah, I remember, but don't forget that we will fight later on. Tatsuya sighed and said, yeah, whatever, it is no use refusing you, you are going to fight no matter what I do anyways. Sarai smirked and said, you know it. Anyways, let's go and get refreshed and then go to Citri domain. All the peerage members then assembled around them except Coriana. They all started looking for her and then spotted her near the betting table counting the money with a smile on her face. All of the peerage members started to look at her weirdly. Noticing the gaze, she looked at them and asked, what? Koisha stepped forward and asked, you seriously placed your bet on Tatsuya, not on Sarai sama? Coriana just shrugged her shoulders and said, Koisha, you are innocent, while betting only good perception works, not loyalty. I am loyal to Sarai sama, but I knew that Tatsuya would win after seeing what he did yesterday. Sarai didn't give it much thought and said, whatever, let's just go inside. He then started to look for Tatsuya and found him being surrounded by many mates who were asking him questions while blushing. Seeing that, Coriana elbowed Koisha and said, your boyfriend is very Koisha snorted and said, he is not my boyfriend, and then started walking away with the rest of the peerage. Tatsuya saw that and soon followed her, and once he reached her he looked at her and said, feeling jealous. Koisha didn't said anything and just looked away. Tatsuya looked at her for a while and said, how about you show me around the territory after coming back from the Citri domain? Koisha looked back at him and said, you can ask any of the maids from earlier. Tatsuya looked at her and said, but I want to go with you as I know you better than them. So how about it, just the two of us? Koisha, who heard the last part of his sentence, blushed and said, looks like there is no helping it, okay, I will show you around later. Tatsuya smiled at her and said, okay, it's a promise, then later. And walked away. Koisha kept looking at his back for a while, but then she felt someone holding her shoulder. She turned around and saw Coriana smirking at her and said, got yourself a date and not bad at all. Koisha severely blushed at her statement. Seeing that, Coriana hugged her and said, you are so cute, but then released her and said, but we have to prepare you well, because to us girls a date is like war, where we have to strike down the opponent at the first glance. She then looked at her watch and said, we will talk about it later, we are getting late. Chapter 52, Awakening. After getting refreshed and having their breakfast, Tatsuya and Sarai's peerage decided to go to the Citri domain. They rode a carriage and enjoyed the talk along the way. Once they reached the hospital, Tatsuya once again prayed to not meet the sisters and then went inside along with the others. Tatsuya then entered a room and saw a lady with brown hair lying on the bed. Sarai then came forward and went towards her and said, she is my mother, Miss LaBelle, she has been sleeping like this for the past few years. She hasn't even moved a bit since then. He then looked at Tatsuya and said, Tatsuya, I beg you, even if there is a little chance, please save her. It pains me a lot seeing her in such a condition. I can do nothing for her other than pray, so please, I beg you. And fell on his knees. Tatsuya then went towards him and placed a hand on his shoulder and said, you don't have to beg me, I will try my best to cure her, just be calm. She would not like to see you like this when she wake, you know. Sarai stood up and nodded and said, I leave it to you then. Tatsuya nodded and then went towards Miss La. He then placed his hand over her stomach, closed his eyes and started examining her body. All of his peerage looked at him intently, waiting for say his verdict. Soon Tatsuya opened his eyes and looked at them. The others looked at him as well, waiting anxiously. Tatsuya then sighed and said, her case is similar to Ingvild, so she can be cured, and it is also not as old as hers, so it won't take much time to cure her. Sarai then gave a huge smile, but then looking at his dissatisfied expression asked, then what's the problem, why do you look so displeased? Tatsuya looked at him and said, there is no problem there, it's just that I have to again sit for hours to cure her, it would be very boring. All of the peerage gave him a helpless look and didn't said anything. Tatsuya then sighed and said, that's it then, so if any one of you has something to do then feel free to do so. And then started curing her. He then looked at Sarai and said, oh, by the way, before I forget, get me a few things first. Sarai nodded and said, sure, Koisha, make a list and ask someone to bring them as soon as possible. Koisha nodded and did as she was told. Tatsuya told her the things which he needed and then continued curing Miss La. Soon Koisha came back and said, they said that they would be able to provide it by tomorrow, there is no problem with that, right? Tatsuya nodded and said, no problem. Few hours passed away with Tatsuya and others talking to each other and most of the peerage leaving because of some work. Only Saraorg, Koisha, and Koriana stayed behind with Tatsuya. Saraorg and Tatsuya then went out of the room as it was the time for Misla to get changed and wear clean clothes. Saraorg then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Thank you once again Tatsuya." Tatsuya looked at him and said, "You don't need to thank me, I have yet to cure her." Saraorg shook his head and said, "No, what you are doing for us is still too much, is there anything that you want in return?" Tatsuya looked at him and asked, "Do you think that there is anything of importance that you can give me?" Saraorg looked at him for a while and smiled and said, "Guess not, your eyes say that you are not a person who is in need of something, still if there is any time that you need my help, I will gladly help you even if I have to face my fellow devils." Tatsuya looked at him in amazement and said, "You are even ready to face your own people?" Saraorg nodded and said, "Yeah, I am ready to face them. Except for a few people, none of these people even looked at us when we were in need of help, so you who is helping me in my need is of higher importance than them." He then laughed and said jokingly, "Besides, it would be much more fun to fight beside you because if you are in need of help then the enemy would surely be strong." Tatsuya looked at him for a while and then said, "You know, you are an idiot." But he then smiled and said, "But you are not as much annoying as the other idiots out there." He then moved his fist forward and said, "Then I would be looking forward to you support in future, Saraorg Bale." Saraorg fist bumped with him and said, "Me too, Tatsuya Shiba." Soon the others came out and informed them that they were done. Both Tatsuya and Saraorg nodded and then entered the room and Tatsuya again began his work. Time skip. The next morning Tatsuya was still curing her, but he could feel that she could wake up any time now. He then looked at Koisha and Koriana sleeping soundly on his shoulders. His forehead was twitching seeing them asleep. His shoulders were completely sore with both of them sleeping on them, but he didn't complain. He continued to cure her while also suppressing the cause for the disease. Soon both of them woke up and Tatsuya looked at them and asked, "Looks like you two slept well." Both of them absent-mindedly nodded at his question, making him twitch his lips. He then formed 2 glasses of water and splashed it on their faces. Both of them were completely awake now and glared at Tatsuya and shouted, "Why the hell did you do that?" Tatsuya looked at both of them and said, "Punished for making my shoulders sore." Both of them then remembered what happened and blushed. They both then bowed in apologies to him and then went to change their clothes. Tatsuya sighed and continued to cure Misla. Soon both the girls came back and apologized once more. A few hours later Tatsuya felt something change in her body, and just like with Ingvild, he started to increase the supply of magic through her body. Koisha and Koriana also got alert by this and started looking at him intently. An hour or so later Misla slowly opened her eyes. Seeing her open her eyes, both the girls started crying silently and Tatsuya too gave a sigh of relief. Soon Misla gained more control over her body and started looking around. She looked around the room and saw Tatsuya and the girls present in the room. Tatsuya helped her sit up and asked, "Are you feeling well? Are you feeling uncomfortable somewhere?" Misla shook her head and said, "No, I am fine, but who might you be?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "Oh, where are my manners? Let me introduce myself. I am Tatsuya Shiba, a human. I am Saraorg's friend who came here to cure you, Misla-san." As soon as she heard Saraorg's name, her eyes widened and she said, "Ara, so you are Saraorg's friend, where is he? Can I see him?" Tatsuya was about to answer, but suddenly the door burst open and Saraorg came and shouted, "Mother," and immediately rushed towards the bed and was about to give her a bear hug, but was suddenly met with a fist on his face, sending him flying to the wall. Tatsuya looked at him and shouted, "She has just woken up, don't cause such disturbance here. You were about to crush her right now." Seeing her son fly away, Misla looked at Tatsuya with widened eyes. Tatsuya looked at her and bowed his head and said, "I apologize for that, but you are still not in a condition to receive bear hugs right now." Misla waved her hands and said, "You don't have to apologize, I was just a bit surprised by it, that's all." Tatsuya nodded and then started to cure her soreness. Saraorg then looked at his mother while a single tear fell from his eyes. He then went towards her and was about to hug her, but first looked at Tatsuya. Tatsuya, who understood what he was asking, sighed and said, "Don't use too much force, she is still recovering." Saraorg nodded and hugged his mother. He then separated from her and looked at Tatsuya and said, "Thank you, Tatsuya, truly thank you. I cannot express just how much grateful I am to you right now." Tatsuya sighed and said, "You don't have to worry about that, Didn't we talked about it before? Just relax and talk to her to lighten her mood as well. She must be willing to hear about you. Miss La smiled at Tatsuya and then looked back at Saraorg, who nodded his head and started talking to her. He then looked at Saraorg and asked, "Have the things that I asked for arrived yet?" Saraorg shook his head and said, "No, but it will be arriving soon, they will bring it here directly." And then continued to talk to her mother. Soon the door of the room opened and a person came with the things that Tatsuya requested. Tatsuya turned towards the person, and as soon as their eyes met, Tatsuya became speechless and immediately turned around. The person was a girl around his age with black hair. Saraorg looked at the girl and said, "Oh Sana, welcome, why are you here if I may ask?" Sana came out of shock and looked at Saraorg and said, "Hello Saraorg-san, I am here to deliver the things that you asked for, as most of the people working here are busy today." She then walked towards Tatsuya and put a hand on his shoulder and said, "But I am wondering, what are you doing here, Tatsuya-san?" Tatsuya slowly turned around and looked at her with a smile and said, "Just doing some deliveries, they ordered some food so I came to deliver it." Sana looked at him and asked, "Oh, you came to do delivery in Underworld, hey?" Tatsuya continued to smile and said, "You came here to deliver the stuff, right? Can you give it to me?" Sana gave the stuff that he ordered and glared at him and said, "We will talk about this in detail later." Tatsuya nodded and thought, "Why is my luck so bad? Is there anything that can still go wrong?" As soon as he thought that, a magic circle appeared in the room and two people came out of it. One was a twin-tailed magical girl and the other was a girl around Sana's age with straight long black hair. Seeing them, Tatsuya mentally groaned. The long-haired girl looked at Sana and said, "Sorry Sana-sama, I tried my best but I was still unable to stop her from coming here." Then the magical girl hugged Sana and said, "So Ten Oni-chan is here. Were you missing me?" Her gaze then landed on Tatsuya and she asked in a surprised tone, "Tatsuya-chan, what are you doing here?" Tatsuya was massaging his temples, looked at her and said, "Hi Sira, I am busy right now, I will explain you later." Sira Fall wanted to ask more, but seeing the others she stopped but decided to interrogate him properly. While she was thinking this, Tatsuya was in his own thought. He was thinking, why are things going the other way I want them to go? Sigh, well, at least nothing more will go wrong. Again, as soon as he thought that, a red magic circle appeared and then a handsome man with bright red hair came out of it. The man looked at Sira Fall and said, "Sira Fall, save me, Grafia is making me overwork again." Then another red magic circle appeared and a silver-haired maid came out of it. The maid looked around the room and saw the red-haired man hiding behind Sira Fall. She went towards him and grabbed his ear and said, "Surtsk-sama, you should not be lazy, there is still a lot of work left you have to do as a mu." Then her gaze landed on Tatsuya and she asked, "Tatsuya, what are you doing here?" Tatsuya, who was mentally crying, didn't said anything. He then banged his head on the bed in front of him and shouted, "Why the hell do I even open my mouth?" Chapter 53, Get the hell out of here. While Tatsuya's head was on the bed after his shout, all the people present in the room were looking at him. Surtsk pointed at him and asked, "Why is a human here in Underworld?" Sira Fall and Grafia looked at him and said unanimously, "Shut up for a while, I am trying to figure out that as well." Surtsk was speechless and decided to keep his mouth shut. Tsubaki looked at Sana and said, "So that's your beloved Tatsuya, hey? I have to say he is quite handsome." Sana blushed on Tsubaki's comment and said, "He is not my beloved." Saraorg looked at his peerage girls and asked, "Why are two of the Miss and the strongest queen here, and how did all of them know about Tatsuya?" Koisha was also quite confused by all this, but when she heard Tsubaki and Sana, both her and Koriana walked towards them and asked, "Sana-sama, can I inquire what is your relationship with Tatsuya?" Sana and Tsubaki both adjusted their glasses and said, "That is none of your business, I think." All four of them were glaring at each other. Grafia and Sira Fall looked at Tatsuya and asked, Tatsuya-chan, can you tell me what are you doing here?" They then looked at each other and it seemed that there were some sparks coming out of their eyes. Grafia looked at Sira Fall and said with an expressionless face, "Leviathan-sama, there is no need for you to trouble yourself over Tatsuya, I can take care of this business on my own." Sira Fall smiled and said, "You don't need to trouble yourself, Grafia-chan, I can take care of Tatsuya-chan on my own, after all he is my friend." Both of them continued to glare at each other and then the room started to get colder. Miss La was silently caressing Tatsuya's hair, thinking that Tatsuya was in a pitiful situation and thought, "He sure is very famous, hey, well he is pretty cute handsome." Tatsuya, who was now completely annoyed by their rambling, sit up and then slowly turned his head and said in a cold voice, Silence. All of them immediately stopped talking and looked at Tatsuya. Tatsuya also looked back at them coldly, making all of them shiver. Tatsuya stood up and said, "Stand straight." All of them except Misla straightened their posture immediately. Tatsuya took a deep breath and said, "Maybe you did not notice, but this is a hospital and I am currently healing a patient here, so get the hell out of here." Surtsuke then looked at the patient and his eyes widened. He then pointed at Misla and said, "How are you?" Tatsuya then glared at him and Surtsuke said, "Come on guys, let's move out. He is healing a patient now, we should not disturb him." And immediately left the room along with the others. Tatsuya then sat back on his chair and gave a tired sigh and said, "Who the hell is fucking with my life?" He then looked at Misla and said, "Sorry you have to witness all that after waking up." Misla shook her head and said, No, there is no problem with that, I quite enjoyed it, but it looks like you will be a lot busy later." Hearing her, Tatsuya again placed his head on the bed and said in a muffled voice, "Why is it always me?" Misla smiled and slowly caressed his hair. Feeling the head pat, Tatsuya looked up and said, "Thank you." Misla looked at him and said, "Era, it should be me who thank you, not the other way around." Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then gave her a pendant. Misla looked at the pendant and then pointed at herself and said, "For me." Tatsuya nodded and said, "It has some of my magic stored, it will suppress the cause for the disease and in a few years you would be back to normal, but until then you have to wear it all the time, otherwise you may suffer from the disease again." Tatsuya said that and yawned. Misla looked at him and asked, feeling sleepy. Tatsuya rubbed his eyes and said, "Yes, I didn't catch a wink of sleep last night because of two idiots." Suddenly outside both Koisha and Koriana sneezed. Misla chuckled and said, Era, then why don't you sleep for a while?" Tatsuya shook his head and said, "No, it would be rude of me." Misla smiled and said, "But I don't have any problems with it, and it would be troublesome if the one who cured me is himself not well." Tatsuya wanted to reject her, but seeing her expression which said, "You have to sleep no matter what," Tatsuya gave a tired sigh and said, "Then I thank you for letting me sleep here," and placed his head on the bed while still sitting on the chair. Misla looked at him and said, "You can sleep on the bed, you know." Tatsuya rejected her and said, "No, this is good enough for me, and besides if others came back and see me sleeping beside you there would be a bloodbath here." Misla thought for a while and then nodded her head. She then placed her hand on his head and started stroking his hair. Tatsuya, who was now receiving the head pat, thought, "Now I know why those girls like this, it is very relaxing," and drifted off to sleep. Meanwhile outside, Sarayorg and Surtsuke were sitting together and Surtsuke was sipping on coffee. Sarayorg looked at Surtsuke in worry and asked, "Surtsuke-sama, is it all right to let them be free right now?" Surtsuke sat back in a more comfortable position and said, "As long as I am free from work it doesn't matter to me, besides do you have the guts to intervene them?" Sarayorg looked at the scene in front of him and gulped. The four younger girls were having a fight with each other while being in their respective teams, and Grafia was having a fight with Sirafal. The whole area was either covered in ice or craters, making it look like a war zone. Sarayorg looked at Surtsuke and asked, "Can I have a cup as well?" Surtsuke looked at him with a smile and said, "Here," and passed him a cup. Chapter 54, Simple My Ass. Sarayorg and the others later came inside Misla's ward. There was still some hostility among the girls, but they still decided to bear it for now. They all wanted to ask him some questions, but when they saw him asleep they stopped. Surtsuke, who didn't catch the wind, was about to wake Tatsuya up, but as he was about to place his hand on him his hand was grabbed by both Grafia and Sirafal, who gave him a cold glare. Seeing the glare he immediately stopped and stood back and thought, "Who the hell thinks that a Mua is not scared of other devils?" They then started to talk to Misla, who just woke up, and ask her about her condition. Sarayorg then noticed the pendant and asked, "Mother, where did you get that pendant from?" Misla took the pendant in her hand and caressed it and said, "Tatsuya gave it to me." When she said that, every girl in the room except Tsubaki looked at the pendant and then at Tatsuya. Misla chuckled and said, "He said that this pendant have some of his magic power and help it suppress the cause for my disease." Their gazes then softened a bit and they then looked at the pendant curiously. Sarayorg then looked at her mother and asked, "Does that mean that you are not healed yet?" Misla smiled at her son and said, "Yes, but Tatsuya said that I would be in perfect condition in a few years, but until then I have to wear it at all times." Sarayorg sighed in relief and then looked at Tatsuya and said, "He really is amazing, able to cure a disease which even the best doctors and healers among the devils cannot heal in just a couple of days. Just what the hell is he?" All of them nodded and then start their talk again. Later, Tatsuya woke up and rubbed his eyes, and after he was completely conscious he looked around and saw all of them present in the room. He stretched his body and looked at Sareorg and said, "Well, I have healed her, just make sure that she don't take off her pendant." And he then looked at Misla and said, "Don't strain your body too much for now and make sure to get proper nutrition." He then quickly looked at the others and said, "Well, I should be taking my leave then," and immediately approached the door. But just as he was about to open the door, his shoulders were grabbed by someone. Tatsuya slowly turned his head and saw both Grafia and Sirafal holding him. He gave them a wry smile and said, "What happened?" Both of them continued to stare at him and said, "You are going to answer some questions first." Surtsks looked at him and thought, "Looks like I will get some time spared because of him in future," and smiled. Sareorg looked at him and asked, "Why are you smiling, my lord?" Surtsks looked at him and said, "Just picturing my beautiful future, that's all." Sareorg became confused and didn't said anything further. Tatsuya then sat on a chair surrounded by all of them. He looked at all of them once more and then sighed. He regained his neutral expression and said, "There is no helping it, go ahead and ask what you want." But they all suddenly felt some pressure on them, making those who doesn't know about his powers widen their eyes. Tatsuya looked at them coldly and said, "Make sure that this conversation doesn't leave this room." All of them nodded their heads, but Surtsks spoke, "Can we at least inform these things to the higher UPS?" Tatsuya thought for a while and said, "Only the mus." Surtsks nodded his head in approval. Sirafal then looked at Tatsuya and asked, "Tatsuya-chan, since when were you a part of supernatural world?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "Since before we met." Grafia, Sirafal, and Sana had a complicated expression on their face. Sirafal then looked at Tatsuya more intently and asked, "Then why didn't you inform me earlier? Don't you trust me?" Tatsuya looked at her expressionlessly and said, "You didn't ask, and besides, you are not in a position to accuse me as none of you told me about you being a devil." All three of them looked down and didn't said anything. Tatsuya sighed and said, "And if I told you earlier you would be pestering me day and night to join your peerage, that would be very annoying." Sirafal looked at him and pointed her finger and said, "Hey, I am not annoying at all." When she said that, all of them looked at her with a deadpan expression. Seeing everyone looking at her like that, she hugged Sana and said, "So Tan, they are being mean to Oni-chan." Sana tried to push her away and said, "Oni-sama, stay away, you are embarrassing me." Grafia then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Ignoring all this nonsense, I would also like to ask about your powers and how you are acquainted with Sareorg-sama." When Tatsuya heard the question, his gaze intensified at them, as making them shudder. He then said, "Regarding that, I would like to ask something first." He then intertwined his fingers and placed his head on it and said, "You must be aware of a devil named Ingvild Leviathan, right?" Hearing the name Leviathan, all of them except Sareorg's peerage became tensed. Sirafal nodded her head and said, "Yes, I know about her. She was a patient suffering from the same disease as Miss Lasan, but went missing about a week ago. Do you have some information about her?" Tatsuya looked amused and said, "Missing, you say? That's quite different from what I know." This time Surtsks came forward and asked, "Then do you care to tell us about that?" Tatsuya looked at him for a while and said, "According to my information, she was kidnapped and was sent to the human world in order to be sold." When the devils heard this, they became shocked, and Sareorg's peerage were angry again. Tatsuya then continued, "But what I find interesting here is how can you devils not employ any guards or set cameras around her room, when you all know that the old Mua faction can come here to take her away? Don't you all find it amusing?" He then stood up and walked towards the Miss and said, "It's just like someone has done this on purpose, and the only ones I can think of who have such authority are the people who govern the Devil Society." He then stopped beside the Miss and said coldly, "You didn't played any part in this incident, right?" and imposed pressure on them. Hearing his cold voice and feeling the pressure surrounding them, both Surtsks and Sirafal started sweating. Both of them were looking at Tatsuya in fear but were still admiring his power. The others were looking at them with a confused expression, but Grafia, who was experienced with such situations, was shocked. When she saw them as sweating bullets in Tatsuya's presence, she was sure that Tatsuya was imposing pressure on them. She wanted to help them but didn't, as she also wanted to know whether those two take part in the kidnapping incident because she belonged to the old Mua faction as well. Sirafal then looked at Tatsuya and said, "I swear, Tatsuya-chan, I have no idea about such a thing. I only came to know about the kidnapping just now." Tatsuya used his telepathy in her thoughts and confirmed that she was telling the truth and removed the pressure from her. As soon as the pressure was released, Sirafal fell on her knees breathing heavily. Seeing her like that, all of them got shocked and Sana immediately went to her aid. Tatsuya then looked at Surtsk and asked, "And what about you, Mr. Red Hair?" Surtsk gulped his saliva and said, "I swear as well, I have no knowledge about such an incident." Tatsuya again used his telepathy and after confirming he removed the pressure from him as well, but Surtsk didn't fell on his knees, he was just breathing heavily and was looking at Tatsuya as if he was a monster. Tatsuya didn't cared about him and began thinking, so it's neither of them, hui. Then it must be either the other two or someone from the council, most probably the councilman. Looks like I have to do some thorough investigation. Tatsuya soon snapped out and looked at the devils and said, "Oh, I do hope that you don't take it to your heart. I am sort of protective about my family." They all nodded at him, but then Surtsk looked at him and said, "Wait, does that mean that she is with you right now?" Tatsuya nodded and looked at Koisha and said, "Koisha, if you may." Koisha nodded and started explaining them about the incident. After she was done explaining, all the devil were silent. Surtsk then looked at Tatsuya and bowed his head and said, "Tatsuya, I would like to apologize for all the troubles we have caused you, if there is anything that we could do for you." Tatsuya then waved his hand and said, "I don't want anything, just make sure that you keep your mouth shut." They all nodded and then Sana looked at him and said, "Tatsuya, there is something that I would like to ask." Tatsuya looked at her and nodded. Sana nodded her head and said, "What powers do you have, and most importantly, what are you?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "I am not telling you about my powers, that's a secret, and regarding what I am just a simple human." All of them looked at him and said, "Simple my ass." Tatsuya was taken aback by them and said, "Hey, that's very rude of you." Sirafal looked at him and said, "There is no way you are simple at all. You can cure an almost incurable disease, make Tumas sweat under you pressure and hide you presence to the point where we cannot even detect it. What part of you is simple?" When she said that, the others nodded their head in approval. Tatsuya's lips twitched on seeing their actions, but he didn't think about it too much and sighed. He then stood up and said, "Whatever, I should go back now, it's already late." But as he said that, both Koisha and Sana came in front of him and said, "Wait." But Tatsuya didn't wait it and said, "Sorry, but we will talk later." And teleported away. Both Sana and Koisha looked at the empty space in front of them and thought, "I wanted to ask him what is his relationship with her. Well, whatever, I will deal with it later." As Tatsuya appeared in his room, he sighed and said, "Why do I feel like I just dodged a bullet?" Chapter 55, Meeting the Crow. After coming back home, he was bombarded with questions from all the girls and he had to sit for hours to answer all of their questions. He even informed them about his confrontation with Sana and the others, about his identity being revealed to them. He also told their identity to the girls and warned them not to tell about their powers. After answering all of their questions, Tatsuya decided to sleep, but when he noticed that the others were following him, he turned around and asked, "What do you want now?" They all said at the same time, "We will be sleeping with you tonight." Tatsuya raised his brow and asked, "And why do I owe this pleasure?" Kurumi came forward and said, "Do you even need any permission to sleep with us?" Tatsuya looked at her and then said, "No, you three are understandable, but why is Ingvild coming with you three as well?" All of them then looked at Ingvild, making her nervous. Ingvild then built up some courage and said, "What? I don't want to sleep alone when all of you are sleeping together." Tatsuya looked at her and said, "But are you sure? I will be sleeping there as well." Ingvild nodded her head and said sheepishly, "You don't need to worry about that, I can manage. Besides, you were the one who healed me and I heard from others that you held onto my hand all the time while you healed me, so it's not a big deal." Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then sighed and said, "Okay, you four on the bed, I will sleep on the floor." The others started to refute, but Tatsuya stood silent for a while and then said, "Look, it will not fit with me to make Ingvild sleep with us like that, so let's just sleep like that." They were still reluctant but still nodded their heads. Seeing that, Tatsuya smiled and said, "In return we can go on a date if you want." Their mood changed in an instant and they hugged him and then went inside his room. Tatsuya then looked at Ingvild and said, "You don't have to force yourself to do what others are doing, you are free now and should do what you want. Even if you are in my team, you still have your own will, so just follow it." He then patted his head and then went inside the room. Ingvild stood there for a while and then put her hand on where Tatsuya patted. She then blushed and suddenly shook her head. After clearing her thoughts she smiled and then went inside the room to sleep. The next day Tatsuya woke up first and saw everyone clinging to him, even Ingvild was there. He gave a tired sigh but smiled at them. He then went for his workout and after coming back home he found the others doing what they usually did. Ingvild and Himura preparing breakfast while also teaching Miyuki and Kurumi lazing around in the morning. They didn't had to worry about school as they all had started homeschooling and decided to enter in high school. After getting refreshed and having his breakfast Tatsuya went for his work while leaving a shadow clone behind to help the others train much to their dismay. Tatsuya had also given Ingvild a weapon because she has little to no physical endurance. Being a devil and that too a descendant of a Mo made her well worth in magic and she only needed to practice her control as she had enough magic power. Tatsuya had given her a extensible lightning whip Lucy's whip from Fairy Tail. The whip also have the ability to absorb any lightning or thunder attacks and use it against the opponents. It was a good match for her as when combined with her water magic it would be very effective. It was good for both mid-range and long-range enemies. It was also very versatile as it can be hardened to form a rod or spear as well. For close range she was being taught different martial arts. Tatsuya didn't work for 2 days so he decided to work till the time the restaurant closes. After working till late in the evening Tatsuya was about to close the gate but when he came out he met 2 people there, one man with black and blonde hair and one boy close to his age with silver hair. Tatsuya looked at the boy and said, "Oh, if it isn't my dear friend Vali, what are you doing here?" Vali looked at him and suddenly rage took over him and he grabbed his collar and said, "You, what the hell did you write in that letter of yours?" Tatsuya didn't said anything and smacked his head making his face plastered in the ground. He then looked at the man and said, "And you must be Azazel, Vali's parent, right?" Azazel had a sweat drop seeing Vali on the ground but he then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Yeah, I am Azazel, nice to meet you." Tatsuya looked at him and bowed and said, Sorry, where are my manners? I am Tatsuya Shiba, Vali's friend. I am the one who wrote that letter to you." Azazel nodded and then looked at the restaurant and said, "Anyways, is this place about to close? We decided to use the coupon today but it looks like we are a bit late." Tatsuya looked at him and said, "Well, I was about to close but since Vali is a dear friend of mine, do come in." He then took Vali's hand and started dragging him. Azazel was again speechless but simply followed him. He sat on the counter and Tatsuya made Vali sit on one as well. He then took a bucket with of water and splashed it on him making him wake up. Vali was completely drenched and his eyes were covered with his wet hair. Tatsuya then moved his hair a bit to see his open eyes and said with a nod, "Looks like you have woken up." He then placed a menu in front of him and said, "Now tell me, what do you want to eat, my dear friend?" Vali groaned when he heard him. He then took the menu and then looked at Azazel and asked, "I can order anything, right?" Azazel looked at him and gave a thumbs up. Vali looked at Tatsuya and said, "Bring me the most expensive dish, with the most expensive non-alcoholic drink, with the most expensive dessert then." When Azazel heard him he choked on the water he was drinking and glared at Vali. Vali looked back at him and said with a smug, "You said that I can order anything." Azazel sighed and then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Bring me the same as him, just with the best alcohol that you have." Tatsuya then looked at him and said, "You sure about that? We have some good quality stuff, but can you handle it?" Azazel looked at him with a smirk and said, "Bring it on, kid, you are 1,000 years too young to challenge me." Tatsuya wrote their orders and said, "Wait for a while." He started walking away but then turned to Vali and asked, "Do you want a towel to dry yourself up?" Vali shook his head and said, "No need," and then used his magic to dry himself. Seeing Vali use magic in front of a human, Azazel was about to reprimand him but Tatsuya looked at him and said, "I already know, you don't have to worry, fallen angel-san." And then went in the kitchen. Azazel was stupefied by the sudden development and then looked at Vali for answers. Vali looked at him and said, "What? Do you think that a normal human has the power to beat me to shit? It must be obviously clear to someone with your experience that he belongs to the supernatural world." Azazel was about to say something but then stood silent at Vali's reasoning. He then looked at Vali and asked, "How strong is he?" Vali turned serious and clenched his fist and said, "He wiped the floor with me without even a scratch on his body, that's strong." Azazel's eyes widened at his answer. He then thought for a while and asked, "Does he possesses a sacred gear?" Vali thought for a while and then said, "I don't know, but he was able to copy my divine dividing, even the balance breaker. It was a perfect copy of my armor." When Azazel heard this his throat went dry and then many possibilities started to run through his mind. He then turned serious and asked, "Is he a threat to us?" Vala was about to answer, but then a voice was heard which said, "As long as you don't stand in my way, I will not do anything to you." He placed their food on their table and said, "But be on my bad side and I can't promise that you will live long." He said that with a smile but still released his pressure on them. Both Vala and Azazel were shocked and quickly nodded their heads. Tatsuya smiled and released the pressure and said, "Good then, if all that is over, let's have our dinner then," and placed his own plate on the table. Both Vala and Azazel were looking at him weirdly, but then they smelled the aroma coming from the food. They forgot all about the previous conversation and started devouring their meals. All three of them talked to each other while eating, making all of them to ease their tension. Azazel even offered Tatsuya to join Grigori, but Tatsuya simply declined, saying that he will not work under others. After having their meal, Vala and Tatsuya were looking at a passed out Azazel who was mumbling something about his bedtime adventures. Tatsuya grabbed him by his hair and looked at his wasted face and said, "I told him that he would not be able to take it," and released him, making his face crash on the table with a bang sound. He then used his magic to clean up and said, "Now pay up." Vala simply took out Azazel's wallet and gave him the money and said, "Keep the change." Tatsuya looked at the money and asked, "What about the discount coupon?" Vala smirked and said, "Let's just say that I forgot about it, it would be a sight to see his reaction in the morning." Tatsuya smirked as well and said, "Make sure to send me a video as well." Vala nodded and teleported back with Azazel. At the same time, inside Azazel's dream, Azazel was having his fun inside his dream, but then he suddenly sneezed. The woman looked at him and asked, "What happened?" Azazel thought for a while and said, "Looks like something bad is about to happen to me. Oh well, whatever," and continued his fun. Chapter 56, Bad to Worse. After the meeting with Azazel, Tatsuya and the others have started to train once again, as now their presence is known in the supernatural world. Tatsuya has now made their regime even more intense, making them more tired than usual, but the girls didn't complain. Miyuki and Himari were now used to it, and Ingvild didn't complain as she knew that right now she was the weakest link of the team. She was more determined than the others, and the fact that she was a descendant of the original Mo made her progress at a rapid pace. She is now at high class level, much to the surprise of the others. She now actively take part in spars against Miyuki and Kurumi and even fighting toe-to-toe with them. Her control over her whip has grown to the point that she is able to handle any enemy under a 100-meter radius. She also uses it as a rod or spear as advised and demonstrated by Tatsuya. Her magic control has grown as well. Now she is able to manipulate countless snakes made of water and also able to form a barrier of water for protection. Tatsuya has also started teaching her a bit of lightning magic so as to complement her water magic and whip. Ki manipulation and chakra control was also something Tatsuya started to teach her in order to make her body stronger and teach her how to fly without her wings. She also learned to strengthen her body using both ki and chakra. She can also use ki blasts, but they were nowhere as strong as Tatsuya's. At most hers can crush a giant boulder. During all this time, Ingvild Bass also started to show her affection towards Tatsuya, but is not as bold as the other members of the Shiba house. Tatsuya, who has indeed noticed these things, does not try to remain aloof like most anime protagonists and actively receive and show affection to her and others. Not many changes were there among the others. The only major change would be that both Miyuki and Himari were finally able to break through and were now low ultimate level. Their progress relieved them and Tatsuya a lot, as they starting to lose confidence because of their stagnant growth. Another noticeable thing was that Miyuki had greatly controlled her possessiveness to the point that she usually don't lash out on other team members and some other people who try to approach Tatsuya. She is still vigilant though, as she still protect him from random girls on the streets and other people who try to take advantage of him. She has accepted the fact that Tatsuya could not be bound to her alone, but still only the girls she approved could stay near him. Tatsuya and his team also have occasional meetings with the Devils and Vala's teammates as well. At one point Offai started to visit Tatsuya regularly. She would sit on his lap and made him feed her chocolates and other sweets, making the others jealous, but they didn't did anything because they knew the power possessed by the lowly can destroy the world. Tatsuya also occasionally goes to the underworld along with his team. He usually go there to check on Misla's condition and whenever he was bored. He has also met Venelana Gremory and the other two Miss who came to visit Misla after her health has improved, and let's just say that they have a good impression of him. Surtsks has also tried a lot to make Tatsuya and Rias meet so that he can intervene her marriage with Riser, but every time he tries to set them up, Tatsuya turn his offer down. In a desperate attempt, Surtsks even asked him, "Tatsuya, why don't you meet my younger sister?" To which Tatsuya said, I have heard about her from Sana, and from what all I have heard from her, she seemed to be a real piece of work and very annoying. Hearing the blunt but true evaluation of Tatsuya, Surtsu's face twitched, but he controlled himself and said, she is nothing like that. She is a very sweet girl, so why don't you meet her at least once? And whose words do you believe, her brothers or her friends? Tatsuya didn't take even a second to answer and said, friends. Surtsu's face twitched again and asked, and why? Tatsuya placed his hands on his shoulders and said, as a fellow Siscon, I know that you can never say I'll about your sister to anyone else. His tone then got colder and said, and why are you so desperate in making us meet? Are you scheming something? Hearing this, Surtsu immediately shook his head rapidly and said, no, I am not. Tatsuya then smiled and said, good then, if you were scheming something which make my family involved in it, then from tomorrow there would be one less mu. Surtsu paled on hearing this and thought, it's not worth asking his help. Let's just wait for the future and see. Sana and Sirafal has also asked him to join their peerages but were declined, but still Sirafal tried it from time to time. Tatsuya also trains with the devils from time to time, but not as intensely like he practices with his own team. Seeing their practice, his team only thoughts were, who the hell is this person, where is that hardcore training freak gone? He must be an imposter. And just like that, half a year passed, and right now Tatsuya and his team were getting ready go to the underworld in Sarayorg's birthday. Though they were still humans, Sarayorg said that he has only called some people who were his mom's friends. Once everyone was ready, Tatsuya created a magic circle and teleported with everyone else. Once they reached the underworld, Tatsuya knocked on the door of the mansion, and after waiting for a while a maid came to open the door. Once she opened the door and saw Tatsuya and the others, she smiled and gave a bow to them and said, follow me, I will lead you to the hall. Tatsuya and the others nodded and silently followed her. While on the way, Tatsuya thought, every time I think of something to not happen, it always happens, let's try to think opposite of that. Today I will meet the Switch Princess. While he was thinking that, they reached the hall and maid took her leave. Tatsuya, who was still thinking, was brought out of his daze when he was sandwiched between two people, and he thought, soft, and then looked at them and saw both Misla and Venelana there. He then moved back and said, sorry about that, good evening Misla-san, Venelana-san. Both of them did their yufu chuckle and said, good evening to you too, Tatsuya, Mayuki, Himari, Kurumi and Ingvilt. Misla then came forward and said, thank you for taking some of the time from your schedule and visiting us. Hearing her, Tatsuya gave a wry smile and said, you are still upset for not coming here more frequently, Misla-san. She just smiled and said, there is nothing like that, and besides, for Tatsuya-kun, his work is more important than us. Tatsuya gave a tired sing and said, I will try to find time to come here more often. Soon Sarayorg came with his peerage along with Sana and Tsubaki. Seeing them, Tatsuya and the others moved towards them and said, happy birthday Sarayorg. Sarayorg, who saw them, became happy and immediately put his hand around Tatsuya's neck and said, thanks you guys. Say Tatsuya, today you will not reject my request of sparring with you, right? Hearing him, all the people present there gave a tired sigh and said, he never changes. Tatsuya looked at him and said, okay, I will fight you once the party is over, and here your gift. Sarayorg smiled and took the gift and said, shall I open it now? Tatsuya shrugged his shoulders and said, your wish. Sarayorg hurriedly opened the gift, and seeing his antics, all of them smiled, and it was to be expected, as it was the first birthday that he was celebrating with his friends and family, as before his mother woke up he didn't organize such events. Once the box was opened, there were different bands present in the box. All of them looked at the bands intently, and Tatsuya said, those are some training band which can help you in training. You can change their gravity according to your will without affecting your whole body weight. You can change the gravity up to 10 times the gravity of Earth. I use similar bands as well, though mine can increase the gravity up to 500 times that of Earth. Sarayorg's eyes were now shining on seeing the band, and he bear hugged Tatsuya and said, this is the best gift ever. Tatsuya, who was being crushed by the HIG, sighed but smiled later and said, I am glad that you liked it. Tatsuya then heard Sana and Venelana talking. Sana looked at Venelana and asked, Oba-san, is Rias not coming? Venelana gave a sad smile and said, sorry Sana dear, she had a fever, so she is unable to visit today. Sana gave an understanding nod and thought, great. Now she won't learn about Tatsuya. I was kinda worried about their meeting, but it seems like that it will not happen anytime soon. Tatsuya, who heard this, thought, who? My plan worked, I don't have to worry about any. Just as he was about to continue thinking, a bright orange magic circle formed in the room with fire coming from it. Seeing the circle, all of them looked at each other and Tatsuya thought, why does my situation changed from bad to worse? Chapter 57, Aura. The circle continued to glow for some time and after a while the flames dispersed and 3 people stood there. One was a beautiful woman with blonde hair and blue eyes, another small girl who looked like her daughter with similar features but her hair were done in form of drills, and finally a man with similar blonde hair and a handsome face. Misla came forward and bowed a bit and said, "Greetings Phoenix-san, I am very grateful that you decided to grace us with your presence." The woman also came forward and said with a smile, "Don't be too stiff Misla, you can just call me by my name, my friend." Misla also smiled and said, "As you wish Jessica." Jessica then came closer to Misla and hugged her and said, "I am glad that you were able to recover, how is your health now?" Misla separated from the HIG and said, "I have been quite good, thanks for your kindness." The women then went to the side to talk to one another and both the boy and the girl went towards Tatsuya and the others. The girl then came forward and gave a polite bow to the others and said, "Nice to meet you, I am Ravel Phoenix from the House of Phoenix and the one beside me is my brother Riser Phoenix." Riser looked at the others with his hands in his pockets and nodded his head, but then his sight fell on Tatsuya. Tatsuya also looked back at him and then looked away. Riser then pointed his finger at Tatsuya and asked, "What is a human doing here?" Hearing his question, Ravel also looked at him curious. Sarayorg came forward and said, "Good evening Riser-san, I am Sarayorg Bale, from the House of Bale. This person here is my friend Tatsuya." Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Nice to meet you, I am Tatsuya Shiba." Riser then looked at him with a smirk and said, "A human like you must feel proud that you are standing in presence of the great Riser-sama." When he said that, all of them had the exact same thought, this person is very annoying. Riser's gaze then fell upon Kurumi and he licked his lips and approached Kurumi. Kurumi looked at him and asked, "What?" Riser looked at her with an arrogant expression and said, "Woman, you are beautiful. Why don't you become Riser's woman?" When he said that, all of them again had the same thought, great, he speaks in third person as well. Kurumi gave him a smile and said, "Sorry, but I already like someone else." Riser seemed to get a bit pissed at this and then grabbed her hand and said, "I was not asking you, I was ordering you to be my woman." But suddenly his hand was grabbed by someone. He then looked at the person holding his hand and found it to be Tatsuya. Tatsuya gave him a cold glare and said, "I will say this just once, release her hand." But Riser, who had his holier-than-thou personality, snorted and said, "Release me at once, or you will die by my hands, human." Tatsuya didn't answer him and suddenly Kurumi's hand was freed and Riser's whole body disintegrated in flames only to form back a couple of seconds later. Tatsuya continued to look at him coldly and said, "I told you." Riser then became more pissed and fired his flames at him without caring about the people nearby. Tatsuya immediately pushed the others away using his telekinesis and himself got engulfed in flames. Seeing him engulfed in flames, Ravel got panicked as he saved her from his brother's attack, though she could not get hurt because she herself was a phoenix, but still he saved her. She then looked at others and got more shocked. The others who saw Tatsuya getting engulfed in flames thought, Riser is a goner now. They all then looked at each other and then all said simultaneously, "Wanna bet on how much time will he take?" Ravel then went towards them and said, "Are you all out of your minds? Your friend just died and you all are betting. How can you call him you friend?" The others only gave her a helpless look and then Miyuki came forward and said, "Rather than Ani-sama, you should be worried about your brother instead." Ravel became confused, but then the flame surrounding Tatsuya dispersed. All of them looked at him and both Riser and Ravel were very surprised on seeing him unscathed, thought his upper body was completely exposed because his clothes were burnt. Tatsuya looked at himself and said, "Man, that shirt was brand new." He then looked at Riser and said, "Let's leave that for later and continue what we were doing." Tatsuya smirked at Riser, making him more pissed. Tatsuya then felt that everyone was looking at him, mostly girls. He then looked at them and saw them looking at him with a blush. He even saw Coriana taking pictures of him. Not minding them, he looked in the front and saw Riser making huge fireballs. Riser was about to fire them, but Tatsuya negated them and said, "No fire inside the house," and then rushed towards him. Riser covered his fists with fire and started attacking him and said, "Riser will kill you and will then make that bitch Riser's slave." Tatsuya intercepted his fists with his own. His eyes then changed into Byakugan and he then used gentle fist art to press his pressure points and paralyzed him. Being paralyzed, Riser glared at Tatsuya and said with difficulty, "What did you do to Riser?" Tatsuya smiled at him, but then the smile from his face vanished and he said, "What happened? Can't move your body." He then moved closer to him and then activated his Sharingan and used Tsukiyomi on him. After getting out of Tsukiyomi, Riser looked at Tatsuya with fear in his eyes and said, "Release Riser this instant." Tatsuya scoffed and said, "Still arrogant hat, looks like I need to teach you thoroughly." Tatsuya then held Riser's body up with his telekinesis and then covered his fists with Imagine Breaker and started punching Riser while shouting, "Aura aura 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 aura." The other who saw this scene were horrified. Each punch of Tatsuya was making a massive shockwave, and just imagining them to be in Riser's place made them shudder with fear. Tatsuya stopped punching for a bit and then looked at Riser's face. Riser's eyes were lifeless. He looked at Tatsuya and asked, "Why Riser's body is not regenerating? Riser is immortal. Riser cannot be defeated by the hands of a lowly human like you." Tatsuya's hand then covered with black and white lightning, making a loud noise, Chidori with holy and black lightning. Tatsuya then looked at Riser with cold eyes and said, "You say you are immortal, hey? So how about it, wanna experience dying once?" Tatsuya then moved his hand back and then attacked directly towards Riser's heart. But just as he was about to stab him, he stopped. He then looked at the person in front of him and the other person trying to stop his hand. He then said, "Miyuki, move out of the way." But Miyuki stood there. Tatsuya then started releasing more pressure and said, "Miyuki, I said, move out of the way." But Miyuki still stood there struggling in his pressure. Tatsuya then put his hand down and deactivated the black and white lightning. He then looked at Miyuki and said, "Why are you standing in my way, and can you leave my hand, Kurumi?" Ravel. Kurumi released his hand, but Ravel kept on clutching his hand. Tatsuya didn't give it much thought and said, "Explain now." Kurumi came forward and said, "I guess you have done enough." Tatsuya looked at her and said, "And why do you think so? I surely want to kill him right now." Kurumi shook her head and said, "It is enough, see, he can't even move a bit and is gravely injured." Tatiana didn't said anything and then again formed the Chidori in his hand. Seeing the Chidori in his hand, Ravel clutched his hand more tightly and started crying. Tatsuya looked at Miyuki and said, "Move aside." Miyuki shook her head, said, "I will not move, Ani-sama." She then looked at Ravel and said, "Just look at her, even though she is constantly being hurt by the holy element in that attack of yours, yet she is not budging a bit, only to save her brother." Tatsuya looked at Ravel and saw all the bruises on her face and body. He deactivated his attack and looked at Miyuki and said, "Move aside." Miyuki still stood there and said, "Ani-sama, please stop, she is a sister just like me and I know how would it feel to see my brother die in front of me." Tatsuya gave a sigh and said, "You leave me no other choice." He then used his other hand and moved Miyuki aside and then punched Riser. Seeing Riser get punched, Ravel immediately looked at her brother. As soon as Tatsuya pinched Riser, his body erupted in flames and after a few seconds his body was back to normal. Seeing that, Ravel left Tatsuya and hugged her brother and started crying. Riser hugged her back and let her cry to her heart's content. Once she stopped crying, she left his embrace and looked at Tatsuya and bowed and said, thank you for sparing my brother." Riser didn't said anything and just stood there in silence. Tatsuya sighed and patted her head and then her bruises started to heal. Tatsuya then looked at her and said, "You don't have to thank me, Ravel. And I have to say you are very brave to stand in my way in order to protect your brother." He stopped petting her and then said, "Besides, who said that I spared him, sticky fingers?" At his words, everyone's eyes widened and they looked at Riser, whose body immediately fell apart through various zippers on his body. Riser got shocked and then started to get panicked. He then glared at Tatsuya and said, "What did you do to Riser's body, human?" Everyone got surprised once again on seeing that Riser was still alive and talking. Tatsuya then moved forward and then took a part of his body and attached it to his head. When everyone saw Riser, the girls covered their eyes and the boys started laughing. Riser looked up and then got angry and shouted, "Why did you join my dick there?" Tatsuya started laughing as well and said, "Now you are literally a dickhead." Ravel, who saw his brother's body parts, looked at Tatsuya and asked, "Will be back to normal?" Tatsuya patted her head and said, "Of course he will." And rejoined his body. Riser checked his body and said, "Everything is fine, but why the hell is my dick still here?" Chapter 58, I am a human who stands above all. While Riser was making a fuss about his dick, Miss La and the other ladies came back. Seeing them enter, Tatsuya made the dick invisible. Riser looked towards the door and saw her mother there and immediately went towards her. Jessica saw her son coming towards her and sighed, knowing that he must have made a ruckus. Riser approached his mother and was about to speak out loud but stopped and came closer to her ear and whispered in her ear. After saying his problem, he moved back. His mother looked at him weirdly and said, "Riser, I know you are a dickhead, but you should not take it seriously and say that you are literally a dickhead. I guess you should go home and rest." Hearing his mother, Riser slumped in sadness and was about to cry, but then he suddenly noticed something. He then moved his hand down and found his little brother present there. He glanced towards Tatsuya, who nodded his head. Tears of happiness came at the corner of his eyes and he immediately rushed towards Tatsuya and hugged his legs and started saying him thank you and all, but soon realization hit him and he immediately stood up and said, "Why is Riser thanking you? It is because of you that Riser suffered from that." He then curled up his fist to hit Tatsuya, but as soon as he made his fist he crouched down in pain and shouted, "Ah!" Seeing him in pain, the others got surprised, especially Venelana and Jessica, as they were seeing his power for the first time. Riser then looked at Tatsuya and asked, "Why is Riser suffering from pain?" Tatsuya looked at him and said, "See your palms." Riser followed his instructions and opened his fist and frowned. In his hands, what Riser saw was one of his balls on each hand. He looked at Tatsuya pleadingly, who only looked away. After the party was over, Tatsuya fixed Riser's body back to normal and Riser immediately returned home. His mother, who has come to know of the ordeal, apologized for her son's actions, to which Tatsuya also apologized to her for taking such actions. After all that was over, Saraorg rushed towards Tatsuya and said, "Now since the party is over, let's fight." Tatsuya gave an annoyed sigh but still followed him along with the others. Soon Saraorg and Tatsuya were in a training field and all the others were sitting at the sides. Tatsuya then looked at Saraorg and said, "You should use Mr. Lion as well so as to make the fight more interesting." Saraorg, who heard him, became shocked but soon started laughing and then looked at Regulus and nodded. Regulus also nodded his head and came beside Saraorg. Saraorg then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Tatsuya, be prepared, our combined force will prevail against you." Regulus then transformed into a golden lion, surprising the others except his peerage and Tatsuya. Tatsuya kept his hands in his pockets and said seriously, "Use your full power." Regulus looked at Saraorg, who looked back at him as well and after a while nodded his head. "I will show him my true power." Regulus's body then began to glow, making everyone in the vicinity unable to see. After a while the light died down and Saraorg was covered in a golden armor and shouted, "Balance breaker, Regulus Ray Leather Rex." Tatsuya then took his hands out of his pocket and said, "Ready?" Saraorg pointed his finger at Tatsuya and said, "Tatsuya, I will defeat you with the power of the Lion King Nemiya." Tatsuya narrowed his eyes and thought, "Let's use the power of a lion as well," and then Tatsuya's hands began to produce a blinding light. Soon the light died down and a golden one-handed axe was in his hand. He then pointed his axe towards Saraorg and said, "Then I will crush you with this divine axe Rita and will show you the power of the human that stands above all, sunshine." As he said that, Tatsuya's body buffed up a bit, not as much as Escanor, only just a bit. And Rita is also not as big as Escanor's and is proportionate to Tatsuya's size. Seeing the axe, Saraorg became more excited and then looked at Tatsuya maniacally and then launched towards Tatsuya. Tatsuya too didn't wait and punched him on the face, sending him flying and said, "You should wipe that look off your face." Saraorg, who crashed in the wall, stood up and said, "Yeah. That's what I expect from you, now come at me with everything you got." Tatsuya raised his axe and said, "Don't tell me that I didn't warn you. Cruel son." And a small ball of fire started forming over the axe and continued to get bigger and bigger. The temperature around the field also started rising, making it very uncomfortable for the others. Saraorg was sweating heavily but was still excited. The audience were also sweating and their clothes have started to get burned as well. The most surprised were Ravel and Jessica, who were feeling hot as well even though they were Fen-X's. Miyuki and the others used their ice and water magic to cool down the surroundings, but it was of no use. Tatsuya looked at the sun and then at Saraorg and said, "Here you go," and launched it towards Saraorg. Saraorg, being Saraorg, didn't even try to dodge it and took it head on, creating an explosion. Tatsuya put his axe back and deactivated his sunshine ability and started walking towards the smoke. Everyone was looking at him curiously and were waiting for the smoke to clear. Soon the smoke cleared as well and revealed an unconscious Seraorg and Regulus in human form. Tatsuya grabbed both of their collars and started walking towards others. He then handed both of them to his peerage. Tatsuya looked at the others who were looking at him with awe and he said, "Why are you looking at me weirdly?" When they heard him their lips twitched and they all thought, "Who is the weird one between you and us?" Sana then came forward and said, "What was that axe you had?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "It was a big golden axe." Hearing his answer her lips twitched and she then asked, "What was the magic that you used before? It was a very strong magic." Her brow started twitching as well and she said, "Will you answer me?" Tatsuya smiled at her and said, "I did." Sana asked, when just now this made Sana snapped and she started cursing Tatsuya. Tsubaki immediately came towards her and restrained her so that she cannot attack Tatsuya, not that she could. Tatsuya then looked at the others and said, "I guess we should leave for now, girls, let's go back." And teleport away with his team. Leaving behind an angry Sana and Ravel who kept on looking on the place he was standing. The others girls looked at her and thought, "Great, another one." While Jessica was filling a form given to her by Miss La which said, Tatsuya Fang Club Membership Application, Chapter 59, Kill Them All. After the day of Seraorg's party a lot of time has passed by. All the devils who had met Tatsuya on Seraorg's birthday came to his restaurant from time to time. Ravel also informed Tatsuya that Riser was very scared of him and daily checks whether his little brother is at the correct place or not. Venelana, Grafia, and Mil Icas also come from time to time to visit them. While on their visit Tatsuya noticed a bruise on Venelana and asked about it, but due to her being hesitant about it, Tatsuya didn't ask her further and used his telepathy to find some answers. What Tatsuya came to know was that Zudokus Gremory in this world was not an affectionate person like the one showed in the anime and light novels in Tatsuya's world. Though he keeps an image of a proper and affectionate Gremory in public, in actuality he is very brutal and greedy. He was also the reason that Rias is currently Riser's fiancé because he was after the power and wealthy of the Phoenix family. He has also tried to make Grafia marry Surtsks after Surtsks' original wife's death, because of her being a Lucy Phage and single. And when Venelana complained about that to him she was then dealt by him. Tatsuya was way too pissed at this but decided to take care of him later as he want to hide his capabilities as much as possible. He didn't said anything to Venelana and Grafia directly but only told them that they were welcomed in his house anytime they want. Both of them understood what Tatsuya meant to say and thanked him. Tatsuya has also bought his publishing companies and opened many restaurants in various parts of Yasaka's territory. He also bought the studio who was making the anime on his manga, hence increasing his business a lot. And because of all this his life has become way too hectic. The paperwork was fine as he was able to do that with the help of his shadow clones, but he still had to attend the meetings personally as having him at more than one place simultaneously would have been suspicious. Tatsuya even renovated his house and now it turned into a mansion. He did the same for his restaurant, making it more magnificent than before, and all that took him to do all that was nothing. He simply used his magic for renovations and all and used his powers to make the authorities not question him about the changes. Tatsuya also met Seek Vera Agars when she came to visit Seraorg in Underworld. At first she was very distant to him and his team, but as the time passes and they met from time to time in the Underworld her hesitation elevated and she started to open up to him and his team. Tatsuya also talks to her about different mechas, making her more interested and entertained in her talks. Tatsuya has also made the Hanging Gardens of Babylon his headquarters for his team. Though it is too big for them, he has no problem with it as it was very cool in his opinion, though he has asked to not inform the others about their team's headquarters. Right now Tatsuya and the others are in Underworld visiting Seraorg as usual, and right now Tatsuya is in Dulma. Tatsuya was standing in front of Himura who was looking at him with an expectant gaze. Tatsuya sighed and said, "You are saying that you want to meet your old friend who lives in Underworld?" Himura nodded in response. "But didn't you said that your tribe abandoned you and your mother and since then you have been wandering?" Himura nodded and said, "Yeah, that's true, I was abandoned by my tribe, but there is not only one tribe in the Underworld, there are many, and the one I am talking about is the head of her own tribe. Even though she didn't took me in because of other people in her tribe, she still helped me a lot when I was younger." Tatsuya sighed again and said, "Okay, you can meet her, but make sure that you don't reveal your identity to anyone and please don't get caught in some mess." Hearing him, Himura laughed sheepishly and said, "Actually there is." Tatsuya looked at her and said, "There is." Himari didn't said anything and kept laughing sheepishly. Tatsuya sighed and said, "You don't know her location, do you?" Himari slumped her shoulders when she heard Tatsuya. Tatsuya looked at her and said, "You know in all possibility she could be dead or be someone's servant right now. You two must be knowing about the current circumstances of the Nikomata tribe, right? They are currently being hunted. Do you still want to look for her?" Himari looked at Tatsuya with determination and said, "Yet I still want to look for her, even if she is dead." Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then stood up. Seeing him stand up, Himari looked at him and asked, "What happened?" Tatsuya stretched his body and said, "Gather the others, we are going to find a cat right now." On hearing that, Himari smiled brightly and then jumped on Tatsuya, who caught her only to suddenly get kissed by her. She then freed herself and then walked out of the room and said, "Thank you Tatsuya, I love you." Tatsuya looked at the door for a while and said, "That was unexpected, well I enjoyed it, so no problems on my end." He then used his magic and searched all the areas in the underworld to look out for the tribe. After searching for a while he finally found it and thought, "Seriously, the only tribe I could find is under attack. How much of a cliché is this world going to be for me?" Soon Himari and the others came in the room. Tatsuya looked at them and said, "I found them, but we have to hurry, they are currently under an attack, so prepare yourselves." They all nodded and then all of them took out their weapons. Kurumi, who was inside Tatsuya, asked, "Need my help as well?" Tatsuya shook his head and said, "No, at least not for now." They all then gathered near him and Tatsuya teleported along with all of them. Tatsuya and the others soon appeared in a barren piece of land filled with craters. They all started to look around and saw many destroyed makeshift houses, blood, dead bodies, and the one-sided fight between devils and Nikomata. Tatsuya looked at them and sighed. He then looked at his companions and suddenly an idea came to his mind. "Okay, let's check whether you can hold yourself during a battle which requires killing or not. You three will take the enemies on that side and I will take the enemies on the opposite side," Tatsuya said while pointing his finger. Tatsuya then put his hand down and said, "Furthermore, the one who kill the most number of enemies will get a reward." Hearing the word reward, all of them perked up and asked, "What reward?" Tatsuya smiled and said, "As long as it is acceptable, it can be anything you want." He then looked at the field and said, "Ready, go." As soon as he signaled, all three of them rushed at full speed while thinking, "Kill them all." Tatsuya looked at them and said, "I pity those devils who are going to face them." Suddenly Kurumi said, "Why not let me participate as well?" Tatsuya showed a deadpan expression and said, "I only want to destroy the devils, not the whole area along with them." Kurumi grumbled and started to complain in his head. Tatsuya became annoyed and said, "Fine fine, I will let you sleep with me tonight, so keep quiet." Kurumi immediately stopped complaining and said, "I love you Tatsuya." Tatsuya sighed and then looked at the girls once more and then left for his own battle. Chapter 60, Art and Noble Cause. After Tatsuya left for his side of the battlefield, he came across a lot of corpses, both of the devils and the Nikomata. He looked at the bodies for a while and then thought, they really are twisted, to kill the entire race just because of one of the members of their species kills a high-ranking devil. If I were to have that type of mentality, then the devils would have perished a while ago. He then looked away and then started walking again. After walking for a while, he came in front of a large group of devils, but before revealing his presence he used a mask to cover his face like Kakashi. He came near them and said, "Yo!" The people present there got aware of his presence and immediately looked at him. They all were confused to see a human there and were wary of him, but despite of that some of the Nikomata were looking at him with hope. One of the devils pointed his finger at Tatsuya and asked, "What is a human like you doing here?" Tatsuya rubbed the back of his head in embarrassment and said, "A black cat crossed my path, so I had to turn around and take another path, and while walking the path I reached here." All of the Nikomata and the devils were blinking their eyes while looking at him. Then the devil who was pointing his finger earlier snapped and said, "Do you really think that we would buy that crap?" Tatsuya looked at him with a displeased expression and said, You didn't believe me, but these words were used by a very great person and I mimicked him perfectly, how can it fail?" Tatsuya then hit his palm with his other hand turned into fist as a look of realization came on his face and he said, "No, wait, I remember now, he too was never able to make others believe him. Now it makes sense." While Tatsuya was doing this, the devil was getting more and more frustrated. Finally, not being able to bear the frustration, he charged at Tatsuya while shouting, "You worthless piece of shit, die!" But just as his fist was about to connect, he burst into white light and disappeared from everyone's sight, making all of them except Tatsuya widen their eyes in surprise. Tatsuya was standing at the place he was standing earlier with a silver gun in his hand and said, "You devils, surely lack manners. Didn't anyone teach you that you shouldn't interrupt anyone while they are speaking? Sigh, so much for you to live in an aristocratic society." All the devils looked at Tatsuya with hatred in their eyes, but none of them took any actions against him. They all now knew that Tatsuya was not a simple human and were now wary of him. Tatsuya looked at everyone present there and smirked. "You are not as dumb as I thought you all would be, considering most of you are nothing but arrogant shit. Now then, what I want to know, who ordered you to attack the Nikomata?" One of the devils who had been trying to suppress his anger finally failed and said, "Why do you want to know that, and who do you think you are to be asking questions to us? You are just a human, so remember your place, and if you don't know what is your place, then let me tell you, it's below my feet." Tatsuya looked at the devil with an amused expression and then swiped his hand in the air, and just after he did that, the devil's legs were cut off, making blood splatter around. Tatsuya then started walking towards the injured devil who was crying in pain. All the other devils looked at the scene in front of them in fear. They all wanted to help their fellow devil but were unable to move because of fear. Tatsuya stood in front of the devil who was looking at him with fear in his eyes. Tatsuya then smiled and said, "Now what should we do? You don't have any feet now." Tatsuya then lifted his own feet and kicked the devil with some force, killing him in the process. He then checked the area around him and then said, "Let's call all the people here first." He then stretched his arms and used his telekinesis. Soon many devils and Nikomata flying in the air were coming towards him. He made all of them land safely and then segregated them in their respective groups. He then looked at the devils and Nikomata who just came here and said, "I give you all 5 minutes to explain what all is happening here to your friends who just came here, and be careful, make any unnecessary moves and you will." He smiled evilly while releasing some of his pressure on them, making all of them look at him in fear. All of them then began to discuss among themselves, and Tatsuya used his telepathy to hear what all of them were thinking. After the time was over, he clapped his hands to get their attention. All of them looked at him. Tatsuya then gave a fake cough and said, "Now that the time is up, I guess you all know what is the situation you are in." He then looked at the devils and said, "I will ask without beating around the bush, and I expect you all to do the same as well. Who ordered you to attack the Nikomata?" They remained silent and didn't answer him. Tatsuya gave a sigh and thought, why are they so arrogant to not understand how much of a deep shit they all are in? Tatsuya raised his hand and said, "Fine, have it your way," and fired multiple ki blasts on them. The devils who saw the ki blasts coming towards them got alert. They wanted to defend themselves but were unable to, as the ki blasts were very fast. After getting hit by the blasts, they were engulfed in explosion made by them. Seeing the sheer amount of the destructive power of those blasts, the Nikos were awestruck. They were looking at Tatsuya and were hoping that he was not there to kill them. Tatsuya then moved towards the devils once the blast was extinguished. He looked at the pile of devils who were severely injured and said, "I have not killed you yet, but I can't promise the same if you are unwilling to give me the answers." One of the devils who was now very scared of him said, "Wait, I will tell you. We were sent here by the head of the Nabrias family." Tatsuya then moved his head close to the devil and asked, "And what else did he ask you to do apart from killing them?" The devil gulped his saliva and was not willing to answer, but seeing the key orb that Tatsuya made just then made him shiver, and he said, "We are here to catch a Niko to aid him in his experiment." Tatsuya then looked at the Nikomata and asked, "Do you have a Niko among your people?" The Nikomata were surprised by this but still nodded their heads. Tatsuya looked back at the devil and smiled and said, "See, it was not difficult, was it? Tell you what, I will give you a reward as well for answering my questions." Tatsuya then took a weird-looking white doll and placed it in front of the devil. The devil looked at the doll in confusion and asked, "What is it?" Tatsuya started walking back and said, "It's my art." The devils looked at the doll and one of them muttered, "This is just shit." Tatsuya then turned around immediately, making the devil tremble in fear. Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Art is not shit, you know." He then raised his hand and said, "Art is explosion," and snapped his fingers. Once his fingers snapped, all the devils were engulfed in a massive blast, making the blast of the previous key orbs look like child play. Tatsuya then turned towards the Nikomata who were looking at him with fear and said, "I guess that said Niko must be you leader as well." They all hesitated for a bit but still nodded their heads. Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Good, take me to her." Meanwhile at the other side, Miyuki, Himari, and Ingvild were killing the devils at great speeds, making both the devils and Nikomata look at the three of them with fear. One of the scared devils who was trying to run away was then surrounded by the three of them. Miyuki looked at the other two and said, "Back off you two, this one is mine." Himari snorted and said, "Who decided that? Just go away and let me kill him." The devil, who was not able to bear any more, asked, "Why the hell are you killing us anyway? We didn't do anything to you, so why?" Both of them looked at him and said, "I know that we don't have any bad blood between us, but please die for the noble cause." The devil looked at both of them and said, "What noble cause asks you to do this massacre?" Himari then looked at him with a cold expression and said, "Says who kill the Nikomata without any care at all." Miyuki too glared at him and said, "So by the name of Oni-sama die." But before she was able to finish, the devil was pierced a lightning spear by Ingvild, who said, "This is a noble cause because it allows the winner to get a reward from Tatsuya, and by the looks of it I guess I win." Seeing the victorious expression on Ingvild's face, the other two started to argue with her, making the Nikomata present there look at them with a weird expression. Chapter 61, Lowly Magazine. After Tatsuya asked the Nikomata to take him to their leader, they all dropped their heads down in sadness. Seeing them like that, Tatsuya sighed and said, "Seeing that how you all are feeling sad, she must have already been taken to their headquarters." He then sent a telepathic message to the others and told them to come there as soon as possible along with the other Nikomata. Soon the three girls along with the Nikomata came. Tatsuya nodded and then looked at Himari and asked, "Is your friend is in this tribe?" She nodded her head and then said, "Yes, she is here," or correctly saying she was here. "I asked about her from others and came to know that the one I was looking for was indeed their leader, but as you may have already known." Tatsuya nodded and said, "Yes, she has already been taken by those devils." When he said that, the other members of the tribe started to feel guilty and were blaming themselves for their incompetence. Tatsuya sighed and stood up and stretched his arms and said, "Well, I will be going for a while. In the meantime, treat the injured and help them to stabilize a bit. I will leave a clone here just in case." After saying that, Tatsuya started flying in the Nabrias family's direction and thought, "I was planning of going there soon to collect evidence on Kurika's innocence. Well, it only works in my favor. Himari gets to meet her friend and I get an excuse for finding records for her innocence. A win-win situation if I say so." Soon he reached in front of a steel door which looked like it was leading underground. Tatsuya's eyes then changed and he said, "Kamui," before phasing through the gate without any hindrance. He also turned invisible and decided to give the devils a surprise. After casually walking in the underground laboratory for a while, he came across a room which on his opinion looked like a study, as many books and paperwork was scattered all around the room. He gave a sigh and made some clones and said, "Let's get on the work, boys," and started searching the room. After a while, one of the clone came towards real Tatsuya and showed him a marked page on one of the notebooks present in the room. Tatsuya looked at the content that the clone was asking him to go through and sighed. He then looked at the clone and asked, "Have you read all this?" The clone nodded his head in approval. Tatsuya then looked at him weirdly and said, "Then dumbass, just disappear and I will know about this." The clone twitched his lips and said, "We are literally the same person, so don't call me dumbass, you dumbass," and disappeared with a puff of smoke. Tatsuya then looked at the others and said, "Collect anything that looks useful, don't leave any place unturned." The clones nodded and all of them started searching the room thoroughly. After collecting all the useful thing, Tatsuya dispelled all the clones and said, "Now let's search for Himari's friend," and started roaming around the lab again. He then used his detection and found that the scientists and some Nico Shao were present in a lab which was at a level more down than the he was on. Tatsuya again used his Kamui and phased through the ground. After reaching the desired floor, he saw many guards present there, and after checking their strength, most of them were ranging between low class to high class and 2 ultimate class. Tatsuya just took out his guns and fired at any guard that came in his way, killing them without letting them make a noise. Hell, he didn't have to even worry about the dead body or leaving any evidence behind, as he was completely invisible. Even the security camera were not able to see through his invisibility. After walking a while, he came across a chamber and phased through it. Once he reached a door, he disabled his invisibility after destroying all the cameras. He then knocked on the door and shouted, "FBI, open up!" and kicked the door open. As soon as Tatsuya entered the room, he saw a group of 3 scientists quickly throwing a magazine away. Tatsuya observed the cover of the magazine and thought, my entrance must have shocked them to hell while they were literally reading a book on little girl's adventure. One of the devil scientists then raised his hands and said, there is no lowly magazine here. The other people looked at him and thought, seriously? Calming themselves down a bit, a devil came forward and said, who the hell are you and how were you able to enter without anyone noticing? Where are the guards? Tatsuya didn't answer the devil and threw him away using telekinesis. He then moved forward and said, there are two things that you all should know about the current situation. First, you are not the one who will ask questions, only I will be the one doing that, and second, he then gave them a menacing smile and said, instead of thinking how I entered here, you should worry more about how you all will leave this place. All the devils shivered on hearing Tatsuya's voice, but still one of them came forward. The devil who came forward was wearing formal clothing rather than lab coat and was also a ultimate class devil, while others were at most high class. The devil looked at Tatsuya and said, who are you, boy? Don't you know that you are invading in my territory? You sure have guts to come here and alone at that. I will surely kill you, or better use you for one of my experiments. He said that while he pointed his finger at Tatsuya. Tatsuya looked at him for a while and then fired a death beam which pierced his thigh. Tatsuya then walked towards the crouching devil and lifted him up by his hair and said, didn't I say before that I will be asking questions, not you? So what is your name, my shitty devil? As soon as he said that, a magic blast was fired at him which Tatsuya just bitch slapped away. He looked at the devil who fired it, who looked at him with anger and said, you, leave Nabarius-sama alone. Tatsuya widened his eyes and then looked at Nabrius and said, so you are the infamous Nico pervert Nabrius, hey? When he said, Nabrius snorted at him while some of the scientists were trying to hold back their laugh. Tatsuya then threw him away and then walked towards some huge glass tubes which contained then the naked Nico Shao. The Nico Shao looked at him with questioning gaze, to which Tatsuya just smiled. He then snapped his finger and suddenly all the tubes got destroyed. The fluid contained inside the tubes started flowing out and Tatsuya caught the Nico Shao who came out of those tubes. Tatsuya then looked at the enraged scientists and said, seeing that you have more than one Nico Shao you are experimenting on, you all must have been the ones who have been killing the Nikomata. Tatsuya then looked back at the naked girls and then his gaze moved towards their chest and Tatsuya thought, big. He then averted his eyes and gave them some sheets to cover their bodies for the time being. He then looked at the devils and exerted some pressure on them and said, I will be taking them back, you don't have any problems, right? The devils wanted to retort, but Tatsuya was exerting too much pressure on them for them to even move a muscle. Tatsuya nodded his head and then looked at the girls and said, let's go then. Tatsuya started to move and some girls started following him as well, but one of them didn't move. Tatsuya looked back at her and asked, what happened? The Nico Shao had blonde hair and a voluptuous body. She glared at Tatsuya and asked, how can we trust you so easily and follow you? Who knows that you don't have any bad intentions towards us? Tatsuya looked at her emotionlessly and said, who said that you have to trust me? And I didn't even ask you to follow me. If you know the way to the exist, you are more than welcome to go on your own, or you can even wait here with the Nico pervert and co as well. And then again started walking. The Nico Shao looked at Tatsuya and gritted her teeth but sighed and started following him like the others. After walking for a while, the girls started to feel a bit relieved and started talking to one another, and from what Tatsuya heard he came to know that they all were the leader of their own respective tribes and were brought here after their tribe was completely slaughtered by the devils. Tatsuya didn't said anything to them as he believed that the world he was currently in believed only in the survival of the fittest. Once they all were out of the establishment, Tatsuya asked the others to move back a bit and then materialized a sort of rifle and pointed it at the huge establishment. He started charging his magic and then pulled the trigger while saying, material burst. As soon as he pulled the trigger, a small orb formed over th establishment and then started getting bigger and bigger till it completely engulfed the whole establishment and destroying it in the process. The girls looked at the scene in front of them in horror, and they then turned to the one who was trying to argue with Tatsuya earlier and said at the same time, you should be glad that I came back unscathed. Chapter 62, Alliance. After checking whether the laboratory was completely destroyed or not, Tatsuya went towards the girls and asked, so what are you all plan to do from now on? Hearing his question, the girls started discussing among themselves. Seeing that the girls were not going to reach a conclusion anytime soon, Tatsuya clapped his hands to get their attention and said, stop it, you all are coming with me to the Nikomata tribe I saved recently. You all can discuss further after we reach there. He then opened his arms and said, grab on. The girls hesitated a bit but still took a hold of his arms. They have already seen his strength and they surely don't want to annoy him at all. Once Tatsuya confirmed that all of them were holding his arms, he nodded and then teleported away. In an instant all of them were in the area where Tatsuya and his team killed the devils. The others also noticed that he have came back and started to come near him. Once the Nikomata saw the blonde Nico Xiao, they all quickly rushed toward her and started to bombard her with questions and apologies. Tatsuya slowly walked towards Himari and asked, "Is she the one?" Himari looked at the blonde Nico Xiao for a while and said with a smile, "Yep, she is the one." She then looked at him and said, "Thanks a lot Tatsuya," and hugged him. Tatsuya hugged her back and slowly caressed her back and said, "You don't need to be grateful to me, didn't I say that I will help you any way possible when you joined the team?" Himari smiled and snuggled closer to him. Tatsuya looked at her and said with a smile, "Besides, I will make sure to enjoy your ears and tail once we go back home as a compensation, so it is a win-win condition for me." Himari blushed on thought about what all Tatsuya would do to her, but Tatsuya suddenly said, "I am not going to do any of those perverted things that you are thinking about right now." Hearing this, Himari looked up while she was still a blushing mess and with her ears dropped looked at Tatsuya with puppy eyes with some tears forming at the corner of her eyes. Tatsuya, who looked at her, took a critical hit and blushed as well. He hugged her tightly and said, "Himari, you are too cute." Himari, who heard him, was happy and again snuggled closer to him. While this was going on at the side, both Miyuki and Ingvild were looking at Tatsuya and Himari, who seemed to have made their own temporary world for now. Miyuki kept looking on them and said, "Should we start wearing animal ears as well?" Ingvild, who heard the question, still kept on looking at them as well and said with a nod, "We should try it. It looks like they would be very effective on him." Ingvild and Miyuki both looked at each other and then shook their hands, forming an alliance. After a while all the Nikomata and Nico Xiao gathered around Tatsuya and the others and bowed their heads and said, "Thank you very much for saving us from those devils. We would be forever grateful to you." Tatsuya shook his hand and said, "You don't need to be grateful to me, I only did this because my friend Himari had someone she wanted to meet and there was a chance that her friend would be among you all. So if you want to thank someone, it should be Himari." Tatsuya noticed that when he took Himari's name, the blonde-haired Nico Xiao's eyes widened. The blonde then came forward with a shocked expression, and seeing that Himari came forward as well. The blonde looked at Himari and asked, "Are you Himari?" Himari smiled and said, "Long time no see, Asumi." Hearing that, the blonde started to cry and hugged Himari while saying, "Sorry," over and over again. Himari smiled and started to console her, and after she stopped crying they started to talk to each other. At the same time the other Nico Xiao and Nikomata started to discuss about what to do from now on. On the other hand, Tatsuya, Miyuki and Ingvild were sitting in a corner with Tatsuya being in the middle of them. Tatsuya and the girls looked at the scene in front of them and Tatsuya unconsciously said, "There are a lot of cats here for sure." Ingvild nodded her head and said, "There sure are." Miyuki glared at the Nikos and said, "Should I take care of some of those future thieving cats, Ani-sama?" Both Tatsuya and Ingvild looked at Miyuki with a swear drop. Tatsuya decided to change the topic and said, "By the way, who won the competition among you three?" At his question Ingvild beamed with happiness and hugged him tightly. Seeing the reaction, Tatsuya looked at Ingvild with a smile and said, "Good job Ingvild, it looks like you are getting better and better, getting a hold on you power. I am really proud of you." Ingvild smiled sheepishly on hearing Tatsuya's praise and nodded her head. Tatsuya had already told her that she was a powerhouse, having a power equal to if not greater than a superclass devil. But having power and being able to use it were two different things. She was not able to properly control her power, so instead of increasing her power like Miyuki and Ingvild, she focused on controlling her already massive power. Tatsuya then noticed the gloomy atmosphere around Miyuki and patted her head and said, "Don't be sad, losing now only means that you have to leave your opponent in dust when the next time you compete with her, understood?" Miyuki, who was in bliss because of the head pat, nodded her head and said, "Yes Ani-sama." Tatsuya smiled at her, but suddenly his expression turned serious. Tatsuya stood up and looked at the Nikos still talking to each other. Tatsuya went towards them and said, "I don't want to interrupt you all, but it looks like the Nico pervert survived somehow and is now coming here with his army." Hearing his words, the Nikos stopped talking and immediately checked their surroundings using senjutsu. Confirming the things that Tatsuya just said, they all started to panic. Tatsuya gave a sigh and then sat down and started waiting for them to calm down. Seeing his actions, his teammates gave a sigh and sat down as well. The Nikomata kept on panicking, and seeing that the Nico Xiao started to release their pressure on them, making them silent. The Nico Xiao then came forward and said, "We will stall him and his army for a while, and in the meantime you all run away." The Nikomata started to refute and asked them to not give away their lives for them. Tatsuya then stood up and said, "Can you really provide them enough time to run away? You are only giving their lives away for nothing, and if by any chance they all survive, then who is going to lead them in this world full of dangerous and selfish people like those devils coming here?" Hearing him, the Niko gritted their teeth but didn't said anything. They all knew that what Tatsuya was saying was true and they didn't had any way of saving themselves at all. Suddenly Asumi came forward and grabbed Tatsuya's collar and said, "Then what do you think that we should do? Just hand ourselves to him and let him kill us?" Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then sent her flying with a forward flick, making the others look at them with a sweat drop. The others fell into despair, thinking that they don't have any way to save themselves. Suddenly the rest of the Niko came forward and bowed their heads and said, "Then can you save them?" Tatsuya looked at them and said, "Yeah, I can save them." Hearing him, the Nikomata got a little hope and they all looked at Tatsuya with expectant gaze. But Tatsuya, being like usual, was about to ask them for his compensation for saving them, but suddenly he felt a hand on his shoulder. Tatsuya turned around and saw Himura looking at him with worried eyes and thought, "I guess I know what she is about to say." Tatsuya looked at her and asked, "What?" Himura said, "Tatsuya, can you please help them even if just for a bit? Asumi still helped me survive in the past." Tatsuya, who heard this, thought, "Bullseye," and sighed. He then looked away and said, "Looks like there is still some work left for me. Remember, I will be taking more compensation once we get home for this favor as well." He said that and took off. Chapter 63, Perverts. After Tatsuya took off, the other Nikos looked at his team and asked, "Can he really defeat them all on his own?" His teammates looked at the Nikos and said, "Instead of worrying about him, you all should pity at the fate of those who are coming here. He can completely annihilate all the devils coming here without even trying." All of them looked at his team with shock while they all simply smiled. Tatsuya continued to fly for a while and soon he came across the Niko pervert and his army. Tatsuya looked at Nabrius and said, "Yo Niko pervert, I am very surprised that you survived." Nabrius glared at him and said, I will fucking kill you. You not only took my lab rats away but you destroyed my whole laboratory as well. All the years of my hard work suddenly destroyed. I will not let you live." Tatsuya yawned and said, "Done your ranting, good, so shall we begin?" Hearing him, Nabrius gave a menacing smile and said, "Yes, we should begin. And to make sure to surely kill you, I brought the most powerful weapon that we have ever created. Thankfully it was stored in my mansion's storehouse. Bring it, boys." As he said that, the devils who were in the front shifted from their positions and revealed some devils' labors carrying a huge ass machine. Tatsuya looked at the machine for a while and then said, "What does it do, Niko pervert? Does it change anyone in the surrounding to a Nikomata who you can play with?" As Tatsuya said that, the devils who were carrying the machine suddenly lost strength in their arms and the machine started to fall down. They all started to back away from Nabrius and looked at him with a disgusted look. Nabrius saw this and said, "You fools, catch that right now. Why would I bring such a thing to kill someone?" As he said that, the devils rushed to the machine and somehow managed to catch it before it fell on the ground. Tatsuya then looked at Nabrius with a surprised expression and said, "Then do you mean that you really did made such a machine?" Everyone looked at Nabrius with expectant gaze, and seeing those looks, Nabrius became embarrassed and shouted, "Why would I tell you about that? Shut up and let me kill you." Suddenly a devil who was standing beside Nabrius came towards him and whispered and asked, "Master, can we even make lolas by that machine?" Nabrius looked at him and said, "Indeed, but that machine is still in development phase. Once it's done, I will make sure to let you all try that." Suddenly the man's eyes shined brightly with enthusiasm. He looked at the rest of the devils and shouted, "Fellow devils, Master Nabrius have developed a machine by which we can make legal lolas and has promised us to let us try that. Our days of salvation are not far now." The other devils who heard him became enthusiastic and shouted, "All hail Nabrius-sama, all hail lolas." Seeing that, Tatsuya looked at all of them and thought, the whole Nabrius territory is Lilicon. That must be the reason that they didn't even touch those Niko I saved earlier. Tatsuya waited for them to calm down a bit and said, "You all done, pervs?" Nabrius looked at Tatsuya and said, "You sure are eager to die. Okay men, let's kill him soon. The sooner we kill him, the faster I can start making that machine." All the devils looked at Tatsuya with a fire in their eyes and shouted, "Give your orders, Nabrius-sama." Nabrius started laughing and said, "Start the machine." A devil standing at the rear of the machine nodded and pressed a button. Tatsuya got ready for an attack to come towards him, but even after waiting for a while, the attack didn't came. Tatsuya looked at Nabrius confusedly and said, "Are you really sure that your machine is working?" Nabrius looked at Tatsuya and said, "Of course it is, we just have to wait for it to charge up a bit. How do you expect a large attack if we don't have enough energy to support it?" Tatsuya looked at him weirdly and thought, "So this is the infamous charging time. I feel like it is similar to downloading a high-end game on a computer. Well, let's wait for a bit, I am not in a hurry anyway." Tatsuya placed his hands on his shoulder and asked, "So how much time will it take?" Nabrius looked at him and said, "About half an hour." Tatsuya nodded and said, "Well, when it is almost ready tell me, okay?" Nabrius nodded and then started looking at the loading screen. Tatsuya took out a book and started reading it. When the half an hour was almost complete, Nabrius looked at Tatsuya and said, "You should get ready, it's 95% charged." Tatsuya nodded and put the book back. Nabrius looked at the screen and started counting, 96, 97, 98, 99. Just as he said 99, Tatsuya took a rock and threw it at the machine with a bit of his strength and destroyed it. Tatsuya then looked at Nabrius's face and thought, "Ah. That look of despair reminds me of myself whenever it happened to me while downloading a large file. He must be feeling completely torn from the inside now." Nabrius looked at Tatsuya and said, "What have you done? You destroyed it when it was almost complete. How can you be so cruel?" Tatsuya looked back at him and didn't said anything. He then showed him a mocking smile, making him getting enraged. Nabrius looked at the devils and shouted, "Kill him!" Tatsuya didn't said anything and took out his Neo Servresta and started to charge magic in it. The devils didn't cared about him and started firing various magic attacks at him. Tatsuya continued to dodge the attack, and once the sword was completely charged he said, "Now let's test the last one." He moved the hand holding the sword to his side and said, "Void Splitter," and slashed the air in front of him. As soon as he executed the slash, a huge black wave of energy in the form of a slash rised towards the devils, destroying all the magic attacks in the process. Seeing the attack coming towards him, Nabrius tried to avoid the attack but was not able to. To him it looked like the attack was trying to pull it towards itself. Nabrius looked at the attack in horror, and soon the slashed through him and the other devils, cutting them all in the process. Some of them even tried to place a barrier in front of them, but the attack phased through them without any resistance. Tatsuya looked at the one-sided massacre in front of him and said, "Well, looks like my job is done. But today I learned a new thing." He nodded his head and looked like he was thinking deeply. He then opened his eyes and said, "Looks like Azazel is not the only pervert who made something like a gender-bender gun." He said that and started flying back. Chapter 64, That Business Can Wait for a While. After defeating the Nico pervert and Co, Tatsuya returned back to the village. All the Nikomata and Nico Shao looked at him with an expectant gaze. Tatsuya looked at them for a while and then gave a thumbs up. When the others saw the thumbs up, they all cheered in happiness, some of them even shed tears of joy and were celebrating among themselves. Tatsuya looked at the scene in front of him and thought, "I know that they have the whole right to be happy because they are now safe from devil invasions, but why are they forgetting that now they don't have any place to stay or food to eat? Sigh, let's wait for a bit and then burst their bubble of happiness." And as per his thought, Tatsuya waited for them to celebrate a bit more and then said, "You guys seem to be forgetting something." As he said that, all of them stopped celebrating and then got confused by his question, but soon Asumi got what Tatsuya wanted to say and looked at the others and said, "Girls, do any of you know a place where we can stay now?" At her question, the rest of the Nikos got shocked. Tatsuya could have sworn that he heard thunder in the background. All of them started to get impatient and started discussing what to do from now on, but were not able to reach any decision. Tatsuya looked at the situation for a while and then asked, "Do you want to live under the Yukai territory?" At his question, all of them turned their heads and shouted, "For real?" Tatsuya was dumbfounded by their sudden change and remained still for a while. After gaining back his focus, he coughed and said, "Well, I can ask Yasaka about it first and then only we could know." Tatsuya then began thinking about how to deal with the situation. Making the Yukai faction take in some refugees was not too much problem. The problem was that the refugees were originally from the underworld, so they might have suspicion on them of being spies. While Tatsuya was thinking, the other Nico Shao other than Asumi came forward and asked, "Tatsuya-san, no, Tatsuya-sama, can we come with you instead?" As Tatsuya heard this, he felt that the atmosphere got a little colder Miyuki, but he shrugged it off. He then looked at the Nico Shao and asked, "And why do you all want to come with me instead of going to the Yukai faction, as being with your own kin would be much better for you, don't you think so?" All of the Nikoshou nodded their heads and said, yes, it is better for us to be present among our own kin, and the atmosphere around the Yukai territory would be very good for us as well. She then paused for a bit and said, but we want to get strong. She said with a look of determination on her face, and the same was with the others present beside her. Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then asked, and why do you all want to become stronger? Another Nikoshou came forward and said, we have already lost the people who lived with us in our respective villages because of our weaknesses. We would have been dead as well if not for you saving us. So please take us in. We are even ready to be your slaves, just make us stronger so that we would not be in the same situation we were in before. When Tatsuya heard the word slave, a picture of him being in between naked Catwoman came in his mind. He thought that the idea would be good as their ears and tails looked soft and smooth, but he threw the idea of his mind and said, but can't you become strong by being among the Yukai? There must be various techniques that they must have that would make you all stronger. All of them then looked at Tatsuya and said, even if they have some techniques they would be still incompetent against the training style that you have. We know how strong that Himari girl is, and that too at such young age, and all this was because of your training, or as she told us. As they said that, Tatsuya and his teammates all looked at Himari. Tatsuya with curiousness and Miyuki and Ingvild with anger. All these gazes made her uncomfortable, and she said, what? I said that on the heat of moment, I was very happy to meet my friend, and that's why I said that. They looked at her for a bit more and finally sighing and shrugging it off. Tatsuya looked at the girls in front of him and said, I will tell you my answer later, it is not a matter that I can think about in a spur of moment. He said and turned around, making the Nikoshou standing in front of him drop down their ears and tails in disappointment, but they soon came over it and thought that they were still not rejected. Tatsuya then went towards the other members of his team and said, I am going to talk about this matter to Yasaka, you all remain here and protect them, and also decide on the matter those Nikoshou presented before me right now, as it will surely affect our team. Tatsuya then turned around and took some food supplies and made some makeshift houses. He then turned towards the Nikoshou and said, stay here for the time being, I am going to talk to Yasaka for a bit. He then made a portal and walked through it. Soon Tatsuya appeared in front of the headquarters of the Yukai faction in Kyoto. He looked at the guards who bowed their heads when they saw him, and Tatsuya did the same. Tatsuya was now recognized by most of the members of the Yukai faction and is respected by them. Tatsuya's strength and the times that he had helped them previously made his reputation grow among them. Tatsuya started walking towards the headquarters, and soon he found someone sneaking on him by his detection. Tatsuya smiled a bit and then disappeared from his spot. Seeing him disappear, the person following him came out and looked a bit displeased, but suddenly that person was strangled by someone and shouted, who are you? Let me go. The person who was strangling smiled and said, long time no see, Kunu. As Kunu heard the voice, she smiled and said, Tatsuya nii. Tatsuya let her go and was immediately hugged by Kunu. Tatsuya smiled and hugged her back and said, so you were trying to sneak up on me. As Kunu heard him, she got embarrassed and hid her face on Tatsuya's chest. Tatsuya chuckled and lifted her up and started walking with her in his arms. Kunu didn't said anything and simply enjoyed Tatsuya's embrace. They soon came in front of a huge Japanese-styled mansion. Tatsuya came in front of a sliding door and was about to ask to enter, but was beaten down to it when Kunu jumped from his arms and entered the room without permission. Tatsuya looked at her and then bonked her head and said, bad manners, Kunu, you should not enter someone's room without permission. Kunu held her head and glared at Tatsuya with a pout and said, meanie. Tatsuya looked at her and thought, so cute, and poked her cheeks. Tatsuya then heard a cough and turned his head. Standing before him was blonde and bust a lady wearing a yellow kimono, which didn't help her a bit in hiding her huge chest. The most notable feature about her was 2 fox ears on her head and 9 golden yellow fluffy tails. Tatsuya smiled and said, Yasaka, how have you been? Yasaka smiled as well and then walked towards him and hugged him and said, I have been well, but now I am better since you finally decided to visit me. Tatsuya laughed in embarrassment and said, sorry about not being able to meet you more often, but I had been way too busy for some time. Yasaka didn't said anything and continued to hug him. Seeing that she had no intention of letting him go for the time being, Tatsuya sighed and said, look, as much I want to continue what we are doing, I have some important business with you, so can we do that first? Yasaka looked at him in the eye and said, but can't we talk like this? Tatsuya, who looked back at her, was mesmerized and was unable to hear what she said. Seeing his condition, Yasaka smiled and said, Fu looks like someone is enchanted by me. Suddenly they were separated by Kuno, who hugged Tatsuya tightly and said, "Oka-san, leave Tatsuya and I alone." Yasaka chuckled and said, "But it looks like that he was enjoying it." Tatsuya suddenly got back to his senses and said, "What happened?" He looked around the room and saw a smiling Yasaka. Tatsuya then felt Kuno tightening her grip, so he looked at her and asked, "What happened?" Kuno looked at him with determination and said, "Just wait for me, Tatsuya, and I will become more beautiful in future. So much beautiful that you will not even look at other girls." Tatsuya, who was still confused, was suddenly pulled and felt that his head hit something soft. Tatsuya looked up and saw Yasaka smiling at him. Yasaka got close to his face and said, "Then it looks like I have to make you obsessed with me before Kuno becomes that beautiful." And kissed him. Tatsuya was confused about what was happening around him and thought, "I don't know what all happened, but I literally don't care about any of that. Right now I feel like I am in heaven," and enjoyed the kiss. Kuno, who was by their side, was covering her eyes but still looked at them from between her finger and said, "TT, that's as bad, Oka-san, that type of thing can only be done once you are married." Yasaka then looked at Kuno and said, Ara, then it looks like we have to get married soon to this type of thing, right, Tatsuya?" Tatsuya unconsciously said, "Yeah," but soon he became focused and said, "Wait a bit, why the hell am I even doing all this? I still have some business." Kuno came in front of him and said, "Tatsuya nii, you can pet my ears and my tails." Yasaka came forward as well and said, "Yeah, mine too." Tatsuya looked at the golden yellow tails swinging to and fro. To him it felt like that those tails were calling him. Tatsuya gulped his saliva and thought, that business can wait for a while, I guess. Chapter 65, Death Would Be Better. After completing all the major tasks, Tatsuya was lying down with a happy face, and the same blissful expression was present on both Kuno's and Yasaka's face. Tatsuya was then brought back to his senses by a voice which said, "Looks like you are having the time of your life." Tatsuya became serious and said, "Not a word out of your mouth, and you can sleep in my room for a week. Deal, Kurumi?" Kurumi, who heard him, smiled and said, "Deal." Tatsuya then stood up and said, "Yasaka, this time I am serious, we need to talk right now. This is very important." Yasaka, who heard his serious tone, became serious as well and said, "Okay, let's go to my office and discuss what you want to say." Tatsuya nodded and both of them then went to her office. After an hour of discussion with Yasaka and other elders of the Yukai faction, they allowed the Nikomata to stay in the Yukai territory, but will constantly be monitored and would be checked by the others. Tatsuya talked with Yasaka and Kuno for a bit and then returned back to the underworld. He then explained the matter that he discussed with Yasaka and the others and told them that they were allowed to stay there. He then went to his teammates and asked, "So what have you all decided?" They all looked at each other for a while and then said, "We don't have any problems with the four of them being in the team. We would have felt the same if we encountered such a situation of being so much helpless." Tatsuya nodded his head and then walked towards the Nico Shao, who asked to be his slaves. Tatsuya looked at them and said, "Well, it looks like they all have agreed to you for being the part of our team." Hearing this, all of them beamed with happiness and said with a smile, "Thanks a lot, Tatsuya-sama, we will try our best to work for you and will train hard to not hinder you all." Tatsuya looked at them and then gave them a malicious smile and said, "Don't thank me so early, I will make sure to train you for so hard that you will start to think that death would be better than your life." And started laughing creepily. Seeing him laugh creepily, all four of them took a step back. Himari and the other placed their hands on their shoulders and said, "Don't worry, you will only want to die for the first 2 weeks or so." Hearing her, all four of them had the same thought, No, that's something that you should absolutely worry about. They are broken, they are completely broken." All four of them were covered in cold sweat when suddenly Tatsuya said, "Anyways, I am Tatsuya Shiba and I hope that we all can get along from now on." A brown-haired Nico Shao came forward when she heard him. Her hair were straight and long enough to reach her waist, and just like her hair she had brown eyes. She bowed her head a bit and said, "Nice to meet you as well, my name is Shizuka. Please take care of me from now on." Following her example, a red-haired Nico Shao bowed her head a bit. The girl had long red hair and red eyes. She looked at Tatsuya and said, "Nice to meet you, I am Karin. I look forward to working with you all." Then a black-haired Nico Shao with long hair and hazel eyes came forward and said with a serious tone, "Kagura. I hope that I will learn a lot of things under you." And lastly, a light blue-haired girl with short hair came forward. She bowed a bit and said, "I am Sinan, nice to meet you." After all of them introduced themselves, Tatsuya nodded and said, "We will go back to the headquarters first. I will explain to you about your jobs and all, and don't expect me to be lenient, I will make you work to the bone." Tatsuya said in a strict tone, and all four of them nodded their heads with determination. Tatsuya then looked at Asumi and said, "Make sure that all the people of your tribe are here, I am going to take all of you back to the Yukai territory." After he said that, he turned around, but soon he remembered something and said, "And there is one thing that should be clear to you all. All of you are now dead while fighting the devils who were trying to kill you, and since the devils has issued the order of killing your kin, you don't have to worry about them chasing you all." After that, Asumi gathered all of her tribe and all them thanked Tatsuya for all the help that he had given. Tatsuya then accompanied them all back to the Yukai faction territory, and after some word spat between Yasaka, Kunu, and the rest of Tatsuya's teammates except the ones that joined now, he teleported them to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Seeing the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, all the four Nikoshou were beyond speechless, and now they had a new respect for Tatsuya. Tatsuya then asked others to show them around the place, and once they were done, Tatsuya gave them his basic training regime. After going through the regime once, the four of them were speechless. They all looked at the others and asked, "Do you all this much training daily?" Hearing the question, all of them shook their heads in denial, making them sigh in relief, only to become short on breath when they said, "The training we go through is at least 50 times more than the one written in that paper." Tatsuya then looked at them and said, "Once again welcome to the team, and I hope that you all don't die before you are able to reach your desired level of strength." Chapter 66, 2 years. After all the four Nikoshou finally settled in Shiba residence, Tatsuya started his tour cough training, and just like his other teammates' victims, they too began thinking that dying was better, just like Tatsuya promised. As the time passed on, Tatsuya continued to train the others as well, and the one who progressed the most among them was Ingvilt. She took a jump and broke through the mid-ultimate class along with Miyuki and Himari. Though they were happy for her friend's progress, they still felt a bit hurt because of her progress speed. The new Nikoshous were not far behind as well. According to Tatsuya, those four had great potential, and due to their experience in the real world, they do know fairly well how to work hard. All four of them were able to use senjutsu, chakra, ki, and magic as well, which was not even the case with the Miyuki, Himari and Ingvilt. Though they didn't had great talents like the others, they were still able to hold themselves up against them. Tatsuya has trained them in all the forms of energy without neglecting their physical training as well. All four of them were able to perform close-quarter combat and fly using ki. They were also able to use their respective weapons except Shizuka, who only likes to use her bare fists. Kakura was a katana user, and Tatsuya has given her Sasuke's Kusanagi sword, which is also modified to use wind and lighting elements as well. Karin was a dagger user and uses two similar daggers. Tatsuya has given her two Hestia blades and modifying them to suit her hands by increasing the length of the blades. The blades were also able to grow along with the user just like its properties, and its length can be changed as well. The dagger has various status defect abilities like poisoning, paralysis, etc., which can be activated by inflicting a strike at the enemy. Sinon was a long-range fighter, and Tatsuya has given her a shape-shifting weapon which is able to change in various forms of guns and some other weapons, though it requires her own magic for transformation. Though she can even fire ki orbs whose destructive power is much more than her weapons, fighting with her weapon is much more efficient for her. Tatsuya also made each of them spar against each other from time to time. He sometimes even take all of them head-on. Tatsuya has also given the same type of rings and necklaces to them like the ones he gave to Miyuki. Tatsuya also started to make the study in order to make them enroll in the high school when the time comes, though Shizuka was exempted from this as she looked older and seemed to be in her 20s, but she still had to learn about to common knowledge about their society. Tatsuya has started to look more mature and handsome than before, and the same thing was felt by his teammates. Seeing Tatsuya's chiseled body and his handsome face, nearly all the ladies on the streets try to get in his pants. In this time period, the other members of his team has grown as well. Their bodies are now more developed and their beauty was now on another level. There are now instances when even Tatsuya get mesmerized by them easily, much to their pleasure. The new Nikoshou have also started to fight with the other girls for Tatsuya's affection, making the previous competitors feel annoyed. They have also met all the other people from Vala team, Devils, and even Azazel, who after seeing Tatsuya's condition started teaching him ways to control the situation around him, and Tatsuya had to agree that those tips were great in solving most of the problems around him and even prevented lots of bloodbaths. Tatsuya has also earned himself a reputation in the neighborhood for threatening the people perverts who seem to have the guts to flirt or act pervertedly with his teammates. He has even kicked Issei and his friend's ass many times for trying to be pervy around his girls. Tatsuya has also become busier than ever before. Doing the paperwork and meetings for the company, managing the food chains, writing and publishing books. His schedule has become so hectic that he started to use his shadow clones and mind control to do his jobs. Like this 2 years passed by, and right now in the Shiba household Tatsuya is standing while holding a paper and is fuming with rage, even his hands are vibrating while he is clutching the paper. Tatsuya looked at the paper, which looked like some sort of letter, and thought, why, just why is all this happening with me? Someone is seriously fucking with my life, and the worst part of all is that there is no way of not being involved in this shit. Just what is that the one who is shitting me want? Tatsuya then glared at the paper once again and sighed. The letter that Tatsuya was holding was about a trip that his company has gifted him to Vatican. It is one of the companies where he works and he has still not bought yet. Then calmed down and thought, well, nothing can be done about it, and it is not like I will get involved with her as soon as I go there, right? Chapter 67, Blonde. After it was decided that Tatsuya would be going to Vatican, he asked the others whether they wanted to GI with him, but all of them declined his offer and said that they had something to do. Tatsuya was a bit surprised at that and decided to check what they were planning to do by his telepathy, and after listening to their thoughts he came to know that they all were going to have a girls' day out along with the devils. Tatsuya also decided to check the situation beforehand by necklace that he had given to Irina at the time of her departure. Though he hasn't ever used this, and it was only made to activate when her life is in danger. But this time was emergency, so he used his forced telepathy and connected to Irina's mind and came to know that neither her nor Zenobia would be there. Now the only problem that he could face was getting involved with some angels. Tatsuya didn't give it any further thought and decided to just enjoy by himself while he was there. The next day Tatsuya got ready for his trip to Vatican, and after promising the others that he would get them a souvenir, he took his flight for Vatican. After reaching Vatican, the first thing that Tatsuya decided to do was to go to his hotel, and after checking in the hotel he left his luggage in his room and decided to look around the place. He walked around the city for a while, but then suddenly he detected holy aura in the area. Feeling the aura, Tatsuya twitched his lips but still decided to look into it. Though it was troublesome, he was still curious about the fluctuations. He increased his pace and started running in the direction of the holy aura. While he was running, Tatsuya felt that he stepped on something but didn't give it much thought and continued running. After running for a while he didn't find anything unusual and decided to check again with his detection, and found the same holy aura coming from the way where he came from, and started running again, and once again while running something came under his feet and he ignored it once again. And still running for a while he didn't find anything unusual. Getting annoyed by all that hassle, he still didn't give up and again checked for the aura and found it through his detection from the earlier position. Noticing the direction from where the aura was coming for, Tatsuya's eyebrows twitched, and this time he decided to directly teleport there instead of running. He locked the position of the aura and then teleported after confirming that no one was around. As soon as he teleported he again felt like he stepped on something, but this time he didn't ignore it and looked down. Once Tatsuya looked down he saw a blonde-haired lady lying down on the ground with her back facing the sky. Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then asked while still standing on her, are you alright? The lady lifted her head a bit with difficulty and said, I would feel much better if you kindly step down from me. Tatsuya, who now noticed that he was standing on her, quickly got off her and bowed his head and said, I am really sorry about that, I didn't do that on purpose. The lady, who was still lying on the floor, shook her head and said, It's okay, I forgive you, at least you have got the courtesy of apologizing to me. Before, you two people stepped on me and didn't even notice me. They were very rude. I hope that God don't give any protection upon them. Tatsuya, who heard her, averted his eyes and said, Why yeah, those people must be idiots to not notice a beautiful lady lying on the floor. Tatsuya then offered her a hand and said, Here, get up. The lady took his hand and stood up and then looked at him and said with a smile, Thank you. Tatsuya, who now had the chance to look at her face, was mesmerized by her beauty. He then snapped out of it when he noticed the lady waving her hand in front of him. Seeing Tatsuya get out of his own world, the lady smiled and said, I am Gabriel, nice to meet you. When Tatsuya heard her name he got surprised, but he didn't show it on his face. He then did a curt bow and said, Nice to meet you as well, my name is Tatsuya. Tatsuya then looked up and was about to ask her something, but suddenly he heard a growl from Gabriel's stomach. Tatsuya now looked back at Gabriel and found her completely red with embarrassment. He then chuckled a bit and said, Miss Gabriel, will you have lunch with me? Gabriel, being an angel, was about to reject him, but then her stomach growled again, making her decision waver. Seeing her indulma, Tatsuya smiled at her and said, "Ah, it's my way of asking you for forgiveness for stepping on you, and also having lunch with a beautiful lady such as yourself would be a great honor for me." Hearing him, Gabriel smiled at him and said, "I usually don't take such offers, but since you are being so insistent, I will gladly accompany you." And as she said that, her stomach growled again, making Tatsuya laugh, and Gabriel embarrassed. Tatsuya then took her to a nearby restaurant which was popular among the people living there. They placed their orders there, and by seeing the amount of food that Gabriel ordered, both Tatsuya and the waiter was completely shocked. Tatsuya then decided to make some small talk with the angel. And after talking for a while, she opened up easily to him, making Tatsuya feel how innocent she was. Tatsuya came to know that Gabriel is likely to came from the heaven in order to do some business in church, and after doing that she wandered on her own to look around the city, and after walking around the city for a while, Gabriel got hungry, and since she was not carrying her wallet, she started to find an abandoned place in order to go back to heaven, but before she could find the place, she started starving and passed out on the middle of the street because of lack of food. Hearing her story, Tatsuya looked at her weirdly and thought, how could a seraph pass out because of hunger? Tatsuya pondered about it for a while, but then shrugged it off when the waiter brought their food. While eating, Tatsuya and Gabriel continued to talk to each other, and when Gabriel came to know that he came from Japan, he got a bit excited. She told Tatsuya that she liked Japanese food and entertainment industry and was a huge fan of his manga, and when Tatsuya told her that he was the one who created the manga, she got way too much excited. She asked him for his autograph and also decided to tour around the city along with him while he was here. After finishing their meal, Tatsuya paid the bill, and then both of them bid farewell to each other. Tatsuya then silently placed a rune on her, and after a while, when she teleported back to heaven, he marked the spot in order to teleport to heaven whenever he needed to. He then started walking back to his hotel and thought, now that I think about it, most of the mess that I have gotten myself into was mostly because of blondes Yasaka, Kunu, Koisha, Riser, Asumi, Gabriel, all of them are blondes who got me into troublesome situations. He then started chuckling and thought jokingly, I would not be surprised if I got in trouble again because of someone blonde. As he thought that, he suddenly crashed into someone. Though Tatsuya didn't fell down, the same was not for the one who crashed into him. Tatsuya then looked towards the person who crashed into him and saw a girl on the ground with her flip skirt, which clearly showed the white panties she was wearing, but Tatsuya didn't give attention to any of that and had only one word left his mouth, blonde. Chapter 68, Asia. Tatsuya blanked out for a while, and once he came back to his reasoning, the first thing he did was look up towards the sky, raised both his hands and said, whoever is fucking with my life, I just have a few words to say to you. Tatsuya then took a deep breath, pointed both his middle fingers towards the sky and shouted, just fuck yourself. Tatsuya, who was breathing heavily because of anger, soon calmed himself down, and he then heard the blonde's voice, who said, ow, it hurts. Tatsuya then looked at the fallen blonde and moved his hands towards her and said, I am sorry about that. Are you all right? The blonde, who looked towards Tatsuya and nodded her head shyly. She took his hand and stood up and said, it's all right, I was also not looking forward while walking, so it should be me who should apologize. And bowed her head. Tatsuya waved his hands and said, no, I am sorry for crashing into you, that must have hurt you. The blonde, who saw Tatsuya apologizing her, started to apologize again, and just like that both of them continued to apologize to each other for a while. Tatsuya, who was starting to get annoyed by all that, pointed his finger at the blonde and said, why can't you just accept my apology? I already said that it was my fault. The blonde, who heard Tatsuya's frustrated tone, got a bit scared and again bowed her head and said, I am really sorry. Tatsuya finally snapped. He moved his hand towards her and flicked her forehead, making her take a step back. He then looked at the blonde, who was holding her forehead and had watery eyes. Tatsuya then said, apologize again and I will flick you harder. Hearing him, she was about to apologize again, but when he saw Tatsuya preparing to flick her again, she immediately covered her mouth with her hands. Seeing her actions, Tatsuya backed his hand away and said, sorry about the forehead flick, I was really desperate that time. The blonde again bowed her head and said, I am really sorry for annoying you. But soon realized that she apologized unconsciously again and noticed Tatsuya moving her hand forward. She then prepared herself for another forehead flick and strongly shut her eyes. Tatsuya, who looked at her side and unconsciously patted her head and said, leave it, if this continues you would end up apologizing the whole day. The blonde, who received the head pat, opened her eyes in astonishment and looked at Tatsuya. Tatsuya noticed her gaze and said, what? I am not going to apologize again. I don't want to keep standing here the whole day. The blonde who heard him snapped out of her thoughts and said, "SOR." She was again about to apologize, but Tatsuya moved his other hand forward in flicking position, making her stop. Tatsuya nodded her head and said, "Good, now let's introduce ourselves. I am Tatsuya. It's nice meeting you, apology girl." The blonde who heard him became embarrassed and said, "Nice to meet you as well, I am Asia Argento." Tatsuya moved his hand back and said, "Well, it's good that we finally stopped, but I want to ask you something." He then pointed towards the ground and said, "Aren't they yours?" Asia followed the direction he was pointing to and saw various food items spilled here and there. She looked at it for a while and then exclaimed, "My groceries." Tatsuya, who heard her, got surprised. He had never thought that the most innocent and shy girl in the whole series could have shouted like that, but he didn't give it much thought and said, "Looks like they were yours, so what are you going to do about that now?" Asia, who heard him looked at him with tears in her eyes. Seeing her crying, Tatsuya could somehow felt very painful from inside. He then shook his head and looked at all the things that were fallen on the ground. He then held her hand and said, "Tell me, where is the nearest supermarket?" and started pulling her. Both of them reached the supermarket and Tatsuya immediately bought all the things that were fallen on the ground and gave it to her. Though she kept on refusing him, Tatsuya made her agree, finally saying that it was his way of asking forgiveness, which he literally did for a while for crashing into her. Tatsuya then decided to take her back to the church, as it was already very late and there was a chance for her to get into some sort of trouble because of her clumsiness. While they both were on their way towards the church, they kept talking to each other, which made Asia very delighted. She had never experienced this type of joy because when she was in the church, most of the people either kept a distance from her or don't talk to her formally because of her status as saint. Because of that, she had no friends, and that made her interaction that she had with Tatsuya was very enjoyable. After reaching the church, Tatsuya looked at Asia and said, "Well, this is it, I guess. So farewell, Asia," and turned around to leave. Asia, who saw him going back, was very sad and unconsciously held his sleeve, making him turn around and look at her. Tatsuya looked at Asia and asked, "What happened?" Asia, who heard him, came out of her trance and became red with embarrassment. Finally mustering up some courage, she looked towards Tatsuya, still blushing, and said, "WW, will we meet again?" Tatsuya, who saw her expression, had only one thought, and had stopped functioning. Asia, who saw him not responding to him, waved her hand in front of her eyes, but there was still no response. Seeing that, she got worried and started shaking him while saying, "Tatsuya-san, come back," making him finally came back to reality. Tatsuya blinked his eyes for a while and then said, "Sorry, what were you saying?" Asia looked at him and said with a pout, "Don't just snap out of reality like that, you make me worried." Seeing her pout, Tatsuya chucked and said, "Sorry about that, but I was mesmerized by your cuteness." When he said that, Asia blushed and looked away and said, "Don't tease me, Tatsuya-san." Tatsuya chuckled and said, Fine fine, so what were you asking me?" Asia looked back at him and asked, "Will we meet again?" Tatsuya looked at her and smiled and said, "I don't know about that, as I live far away, but I am staying here for about a week, so like we can hang out together while I am here." Tatsuya then patted her head and said, "You should go back inside now, it is starting to get cold. And we can meet tomorrow as well if you want." Hearing him, Asia's face beamed with joy and she vigorously nodded her head and said, "Of course, Tatsuya-san." Tatsuya smiled and said, "Then I will come here and pick you up and you can show me around the city." Asia nodded and then went inside the church. As soon as she went inside the church, Tatsuya's face became serious and he thought, so that Diodora guy has already laid her eyes on Asia, then it means that the fallen angels would be coming here soon as well. He then gave a tired sigh and said, "Well, I am not going to let Asia go with fallen angels, that's for sure." And then started walking back towards his hotel. Chapter 69, Michael. After that day, Tatsuya went around the city with both Asia and Gabriel, earning him jealous looks from both males and females around the city. Gabriel was also happy with Asia joining as well, since she was innocent and a believer of God of Bible as well, and she was also glad because Asia knew about the area well and was guide for both her and Tatsuya. Same was the case with Asia, as she was able to interact with both Tatsuya and Gabriel as friends and was enjoying her time to the fullest. Though she was still unknown about Gabriel's identity as a seraph, but Tatsuya could bet that if she knew she was a seraph her whole trip would be ruined, and to make sure that they were not disturbed by anyone he silently cast a undetectable barrier around which hid their presences so that other people from heaven or church could not trouble them. And right now Tatsuya and others were sitting in a cafe having a meal. Today is the last day that they all would be meeting, as Tatsuya would be returning back to Japan the next day. Tatsuya also kept tabs on Diodora, who seemed to have called some of the devils here from underworld and was currently in the chase from church officials. He did not know what he was planning, but he was sure that he was about to initiate his plan on making Asia get excommunicated from the church. Tatsuya decided to not act quickly and wait for him to make the first move. After all, he did not want to deal with him even before he did anything wrong, because if he did that the whole devil faction would cause trouble for him, as Diodora is still the heir of one of the families of 72 pillars and is also the brother of the Muajuka. Dealing with him now will only lead him to more and more troubles, however you look at it. Tatsuya then looked at the girls sitting next to him and talking to each other while eating their food happily. Tatsuya looked at their interaction and smiled. Suddenly he felt another great holy energy coming towards him, and it seemed like Gabriel noticed it as well. Tatsuya immediately dispelled the barriers so as to not cause any suspicion, and just as he did that the door of the cafe opened. Tatsuya, Asia and Gabriel all looked in the donor's direction and saw a handsome young man with blonde hair wearing a white suit standing there. The blonde-haired man started looking around, and when he looked in Tatsuya's direction he smiled. Tatsuya, who saw his smile, looked at Gabriel, who was hiding her face behind a menu card. Tatsuya then again looked back at the blonde man and then saw him coming towards them. Soon the blonde man came near their table and said, "Good day to all of you." Tatsuya and Asia simply nodded, and Tatsuya looked at Gabriel and asked, "Someone you know, Gabriel?" When Gabriel heard him, she slowly showed her face and said, "Yes, meet him, Tatsuya, Asia, his name is Michael, my brother." Tatsuya, who heard her, nodded and then stood up and then moved his hand forward offering him to shake hands and said, "Nice to meet you, Michael-san. I am Tatsuya." Michael smiled at him and then shook his hand and said, "Nice to meet you as well, like my sister just said, my name is Michael. I thank you for taking care of my sister." Tatsuya smiled as well and said, No, the pleasure is all mine. She is a very good person to have to talk and tour around the city." When Michael heard him he became surprised and then looked at Gabriel and asked, "Ho, talking and touring around the city, now that's some news to me. Gabriel, want to explain yourself?" Gabriel, who heard him, started to sweat and looked at Tatsuya with an expression which said, "Why did you say that?" Tatsuya looked at her and then slowly averted his eyes. He has already grasped the situation she was in and was not planning to join her side to help her. It was her own fault for coming here without telling Michael the reason and neglecting her work as a seraph. Seeing that Tatsuya had already given up on her, she looked at Asia with a pleading expression. Asia, who saw her, nodded and then looked at Michael with an innocent smile and said, "Yes, Gabriel-san was very fun to talk to, she also kept me company during the whole week while we toured around the city." When she finished speaking, Gabriel slammed her head on the table, and seeing them, Tatsuya was trying very hard to not laugh at her situation. Michael's eyebrows were twitching when he heard what Asia said. He looked at Gabriel and said, "So you were enjoying while neglecting and pushing all your work on me, huh? Now I understand why the pile of files which I was getting was bigger than usual during this week. Looks like I have to give you an appropriate punishment for ditching your work on me once we go back." When Gabriel heard him, tears started to form at the corner of her eyes, but suddenly an idea came to her mind and she pointed her finger at Tatsuya and said, "It's not my fault, Michael. During the whole week I was meeting with Tatsuya-san, the one who is the creator of the manga that we usually read. You like his work as well, right?" When Michael heard her sister, his eyes widened and he looked towards Tatsuya and grabbed his hand and asked, "Are you really Saitama-sensei?" Tatsuya, who was dumbfounded by him, unconsciously nodded her head, and suddenly Michael started to shake his hands violently and said, "I am a big fan, sensei. I have read all your books 3 times each. It was really a masterpiece." Tatsuya started to get more and more shocked on seeing Michael's reaction. He could not believe that the current ruler of heaven was sitting in front of him. The calm and collected image of Michael that he had from his own world started crumbling. After that, Michael forgot about Gabriel and started to ask questions to Tatsuya, making him more and more freaked out. Tatsuya looked at Gabriel, who looked back at him with an innocent smile. Seeing her smile, Tatsuya's lips twitched and he thought, "I will deal with her later." Even Asia was giving him a helpless look on seeing his condition. After talking for a while, all of them left the cafe and Michael and Gabriel started to leave. Michael turned towards both Asia and Tatsuya and said, "It was nice meeting both of you and thank you for taking care of me and my sister today." Tatsuya smiled and said, "It was my pleasure that you spent some of your time with us. It was enjoyable for me as well." He then looked at Gabriel, who was talking with Asia, who seemed a bit sad because of today being the last day that she will be seeing her. Tatsuya then smiled and said, "When the next time we meet, make sure to complete your work beforehand and not ditch it on your brother." When they heard him, all of them had different reactions. Michael narrowed his eyes and looked at Gabriel and said, "Yes, I will make sure that it not happens again." Gabriel began sweating again and was panicking after hearing her brother. Asia was chuckling on seeing Gabriel, making her feel betrayed. Gabriel then walked towards Tatsuya and said, "You don't have to remind him." Tatsuya just smiled at her, and seeing that she sighed and smiled as well. Tatsuya then looked at her and said, "It was nice meeting you here in Vatican. Though our meeting was not normal, still enjoyed touring with you a lot." Gabriel, who heard him, suddenly hugged him, making all three of them surprised. She then said, "I enjoyed it as well. It was the first time that I was able to have so much fun, and it was because of you I was able to make a friends as well." She then began to tear up a bit and said, "Will you come back to see me again? I want to meet you in Asia again and enjoy around just like we did during this week." Tatsuya, who heard her, smiled as well and hugged her back and said, "I don't know if I will come back here or not, but I promise you that we will meet again, and at that time we will again have fun just like we did, and if you ever feel too lonely you can always come to Kyoto. I will be there always, or you can just call me whenever you want to talk." Gabriel stopped crying and nodded her head while still hugging him. She then stopped hugging him and then stood in front of him smiling. Tatsuya smiled as well and then moved his hand forward. In his hand was a small box covered in gift wrap. Gabriel looked at the box curiously and Tatsuya said, "Here, a gift for you." When she heard that, she became happy and immediately took it from him and started opening it. Seeing her like that, all three of them started chuckling at her childishness. Once Gabriel opened the box, it contained a beautiful necklace with a pendant having two angelic wings and a yellow gemstone similar to her hair. She then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Thank a lot, Tatsuya, it's very beautiful." Tatsuya smiled and nodded her head, but then Gabriel took the necklace in her hand, then moved her hand in front of Tatsuya, making him confused. She smiled and said, "Tie it around my neck." Tatsuya took the necklace and tied it. Gabriel then turned around and showed the others, "How does it look on me?" All of them smiled and complimented her. Gabriel then placed her hand on her chin, making a thinking pose and said, "Now what should I give you to make you remember me?" Tatsuya, who heard him, waved his hand and said, "There is no need for something like that." But Gabriel ignored him and continued thinking. After thinking for a while, her face brightened up and she hit her palm with her fist and said, "I know, there was a movie I once saw, yeah, that is perfect." And started moving towards Tatsuya. Tatsuya, who saw her coming towards him, decided to use his telepathy to hear what she was thinking, but before he was able to, Tatsuya was kissed by Gabriel. Seeing what she just did, all the people standing there had their eyes widened and some of the passers-by were smiling on seeing them. Gabriel then moved back, leaving behind a stupefied Tatsuya and a blushing Asia. Gabriel, who saw both of them, became confused and looked at Michael and asked, "What happened, Michael? Why are they like that?" Michael, who heard her, grabbed her shoulders and started shaking her and asked, "Why did you just kiss him? Do you know what could have happened?" Gabriel became even more confused and said, "What is wrong with that? I saw in a movie that the girl kissed the boy on the lips when she saw her friend leaving her for a long time." Hearing her, all three of them thought, "So innocent." Michael sighed and thought, "Good thing that she didn't had any lust in that kiss, otherwise she would have fallen before she knew it." He then saw his sister, who was looking confused when Tatsuya was scolding her. Michael smiled and thought, "Still, it looks like my sister finally found someone she like. It looks like I have to increase the pace of working on that dimensional chamber, or else the day when she falls is not far away." Chapter 70, Leaving Vatican. After Tatsuya was done scolding Gabriel, thought it still didn't had any effect on her, Michael and Gabriel left, leaving Tatsuya alone with Asia. Both of them stood there for a while and Tatsuya looked at Asia and said, "Well, should we get going as well?" Asia, who heard him, nodded her head in silence. Seeing her like that, Tatsuya came closer to her and flicked her forehead lightly, making her hold her forehead in a bit of pain. She then looked at Tatsuya, who was looking at her with a neutral expression. Tatsuya then took a step forward and said, "You should not be sad that Gabriel will not be able to meet with you for a while, instead you should think about what all you will do once you meet her again soon." She is still your friend and will remain one, unless both of you have some dispute. Tatsuya then smiled and patted her head. Asia, who was sad just a moment before, wiped her eyes and smiled and said, "Yes, I will wait to meet her again." Tatsuya then moved his hand back and then both of them started going back to the church. After reaching back to the church, Tatsuya looked at Asia and said, "Looks like we part our ways here." He then smiled and said, "I will come in the morning to visit you before going back." Asia, who now remembered that Tatsuya would also be going back to Japan, was sad once again but didn't got depressed like earlier. She then smiled and said, "Domu, see you tomorrow then. And surely promise me to come here tomorrow." Tatsuya, who saw her smile, smiled as well and said, Yeah, I promise you that I will surely come." And turned around and started walking away. Soon Tatsuya came back to his room in the hotel and decided to take a bath to get refreshed. And after taking his bath he lied on the bed in order to sleep. Few hours later, Tatsuya suddenly got up and was still a little sleepy. He hurriedly went to the bathroom and splashed water on his face so as to reduce his sleepiness. Tatsuya then wiped his face and thought, "Those devils are starting to act a bit suspicious, well, let's confront them before they are able to lay a hand on Asia." He then changed his clothes and then put a mask on his face in order to hide his identity. He then hid his presence altogether and turned invisible and started to fly towards the devils. Soon he came across some devils fighting against some church exorcists. Tatsuya saw the battle between the two parties and it was clear that the devils were on the winning side. Tatsuya then noticed a young man fighting on the devil's side. The young devil had dark green hair and golden eyes, and from his appearance Tatsuya concluded that he was the one who is called Diodora Astaroth. Tatsuya observed them for a while and was waiting for him to make a move towards Asia, but even after waiting for an hour Diodora didn't do anything other than fighting. After a while, when all the exorcists were killed, all the devils gave aside and then sat down on the ground. One of them looked towards Diodora and said, "Boss, do you really think that it is really worth it for just one single nun?" When Tatsuya heard this, his ears perked up and he started listening to them intently. Diodora looked towards the devil and said, "Of course it is worth for that nun, she has a healing type sacred gear as well, and just because of that she is very famous among the masses. Now just think about it, the look which she would have once she is betrayed by the ones who revered her as a saint. I can't wait to see that look for myself. And once she has gone through all that, I who was responsible for all the suffering she went through by healing me would take her in my peerage, and she will not even hesitate because she doesn't have anyone to rely on." Tatsuya was getting angrier and angrier on hearing his plan. He just wanted to kill him on the spot, but didn't do so because technically he was still innocent and hasn't harmed her yet. Another devil then looked towards Diodora and said, "Then why did you send one of the devils disguised as yourself to her location instead of going yourself?" Tatsuya, who heard this, became shocked and then used his clairvoyance to check Asia's location and indeed saw an injured devil lying in front of the church. He then didn't wait for them to talk anymore and immediately used his telepathy to hear their thoughts. After hearing all their thoughts, Tatsuya gritted his teeth in rage and then made a huge energy blast and fired it towards the devils. He didn't even waited to see the results after the explosion and immediately teleported in an empty location near the church and started running towards Asia's location. What Tatsuya learned from hearing their thoughts was that instead of actually going near Asia, Diodora disguised a hypnotized devil like him and then sent him there after injuring him, and decided to make a similar scar on himself after he was healed and then dispose that devil. He did this because there was a chance of an exorcist killing him in an injured state even before Asia can heal him. Tatsuya soon reached her and saw her still healing the devil. Tatsuya frowned and immediately ran towards her, grabbed her hand and separated her from the devil. Asia, who saw someone stopping her from healing the devil, was surprised and started to struggle in order to free herself. Tatsuya, who saw her struggle, held her more tightly and said, "Asia, stop, this is me, Tatsuya." When Asia heard his voice, she got surprised and stopped struggling. She then looked at Tatsuya and said, "What are you doing here, Tatsuya-san?" Tatsuya then let her go as she had calmed down and said, "I cannot tell you right now, we will talk about this later." He then looked at the position where Asia was healing the devil and saw that the devil had already gone. Tatsuya was angry on seeing that and now knew what was going to happen there soon. And just like his expectations, some of the nuns and priests gathered around him and Asia and started calling her witch and heretic because she healed a devil. Tatsuya, who saw how soon they started accusing someone who they were calling saint not too long ago, was very angry with them. He would have even destroyed the church in front of him if Asia was not with her right now. Asia, who was now seeing the others accusing her for healing a devil and calling her witch and heretic, was crying on seeing the people that she trusted treating her like that. She then saw some of the people among the crowd throw rocks at her. She shut her eyes and was shaking on fear and expecting to get hurt. She continued to wait for the rock to hit her, but she didn't felt any pain at all. She then opened her eyes and saw someone standing in front of her and shielding her from the rocks. She looked at the person's back and unconsciously muttered, "Tatsuya-san." Tatsuya, who heard her, turned around and lifted his mask a bit, which revealed a small yet comforting smile to her. He then put his mask back and then used a magic on the people gathered around them and made them all unconscious. After checking all of them were unconscious, Tatsuya looked at Asia and removed his mask and said, "I know that you have many questions and that you must be feeling very bad, but let's get out of here first." Asia, who was still shivering with fear, nodded her head and tried to stand up but was unable to. Seeing that, Tatsuya crouched down and then lifted her in a princess carry and started flying away after turning himself and Asia invisible. Asia hugged him tightly and was still crying because of what happened to her just now, and seeing that, Tatsuya started to console her. Tatsuya was fuming with rage and was blaming himself for not checking on her before instead of waiting for Diodora. He was then brought out of his inner turmoil when he heard Asia's hand on his cheek. Asia, who had been crying for a while, looked at Tatsuya and felt that he was very sad and angry and placed her hand on his cheeks in order to gain his attention. Tatsuya looked at her and then increased his speed, and soon he reached an empty park. He then landed there and both of them then sat on the bench. Asia then looked at Tatsuya, who looked at her as well, and both of them asked at the same time, "Are you all right?" Tatsuya then nodded his head and said, "Forget about me, tell me, are you all right? You are not hurt anywhere, are you?" Asia shook her head and said, "No, I am not hurt thanks to you." Tatsuya, who heard her, smiled, but soon his smile disappeared and he bowed his head in front of her, making her surprised, and said, "I am sorry, Asia." Asia, who heard him, waved her hands and said, "You don't have to apologize, Tatsuya-san, it was not you who did all that to me." Tatsuya then shook his head and said, "No, if I had come earlier then I could have saved you from all this from happening, if only I noticed it sooner." Asia was now confused after Tatsuya said all that. Tatsuya, who saw her confused expression, started to tell her what he was talking about except for his previous life knowledge part. Asia, who now understood what all happened, hugged Tatsuya and said, "It was not your fault, Tatsuya-san, you tried to save me even though you didn't know about their plan from the beginning. Don't blame yourself for something that you have not done." And started crying. Tatsuya hugged her back and started to pat her back so as to console her. Soon he heard a snore and then looked at Asia, who was sleeping in his embrace. Tatsuya tried to remove her from his embrace in order to lie her down, but Asia was hugging him tightly and was not letting him go. Tatsuya sighed and then continued to hold her. He then used his clairvoyance to check on the devil's conditions and saw that all the devils except Diodora and the one which Asia healed were dead. But Diodora still received many injuries and Hav lost his left hand permanently. Diodora was wincing in pain and soon left by teleporting away by his magic circle after killing the devil whom he hypnotized before. Tatsuya gritted his teeth in anger on not being able to kill him because Asia was with her, but soon sighed in annoyance and decided to deal with him later and then fell asleep. The next morning Asia woke up when the sun's rays fell on her eyes. She then rubbed her eyes and tried to stand up but was unable to. She then looked at her surroundings and saw that it was not her room in the church, and soon all the memories about yesterday flashed in front of her eyes, making her feel sad. Her gaze then finally fell on Tatsuya, in whose embrace she was sleeping earlier. On seeing Tatsuya's sleeping face she blushed, but then soon she began to smile and then again hugged him back and said, "Thank you." Tatsuya suddenly woke up and said, "What happened? Who is there?" making Asia surprised. Tatsuya then looked at his surroundings and saw a panicking and blushing Asia, making her understand what happened. He looked at her and said, "Good morning." To which Asia replied as well. He then stopped hugging her and then stood up and stretched his body. He then looked at Asia and asked, "What will you be doing from now on?" Hearing him, Asia put her head down and said, "I will go back to the church to see if they are still willing to accept me or not." Tatsuya, who saw her sad expression, put his hands on her shoulder and said, "I will go with you as well." To which she showed a grateful smile. Both of them then went to the church, and just like in the anime, she was banished from the church because of healing a devil. Both of them then left the church in silence. Tatsuya didn't said anything to her and let her clear her mind. Soon she stopped walking and looked down. Tatsuya, who saw her, moved towards her and hugged her and said, "You can cry all you want, I won't leave you till you are fine, so just let it all out." Asia, who heard him, started crying loudly while hugging Tatsuya. Tatsuya just stood there and caressed her back. After a while Asia stopped crying and looked at Asia with red and puffy eyes. Tatsuya took out a wet towel and wiped her face, making her feel embarrassed. Asia then bowed her head and said, "Thank you, Tatsuya-san." Tatsuya shook his head and said, "It's all right, but what are you planning to do with your life now?" Asia, who heard him, got depressed and said, "I don't know, Tatsuya-san, I have never thought of a life that I would live outside the church." Tatsuya patted her head and said, "Then, do you want to join my team?" Asia looked up and asked, "What team?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "You see, I have a team of sorts because faring in the supernatural world alone is very difficult and lonely. We too have similar conditions like yours and we live together and depend on each other. You can also make a lot of friends there as well." Asia, when heard that she could make friends, was happy, but then her smile faded and she asked, "But won't I be a bother? After all, I am not strong." Tatsuya, who heard her, smiled and said, "Who said you would be a bother? And if you were, do you think I would have asked you? You have your healing powers, which are greatly needed in our group, who only have attacking prowess aside from me, and regarding your lack of strength, you don't have to fear about that. I will make a tsunade out of you." Asia, who heard him, was wondering what tsunade is but didn't thought too much about it. She then asked, "And what about school?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "Well, you can go to school, but like all of us you will be directly joining high school, but don't worry, I will teach you all the basics before that." Asia smiled and said, "Thank you, and please take care of me from now on." Tatsuya smiled as well, and then both of them went back to the hotel in which Tatsuya was staying, packed their things up, and later that day both of them went back to Japan. Chapter 71. So the plot finally begins. After returning back to Japan, Tatsuya introduced Asia to others, making all of them look at him with suspicion, but after Tatsuya and Asia explained her circumstances, they all welcomed her happily. After all that was settled, the first thing that Tatsuya did was dealing with Diodora. He hid his presence and became invisible before going to the Astaroth territory. Once he found Diodora, he reduced his natural healing greatly and filled his whole room with holy artifacts. He even changed the water supply for his room with very strong and concentrated holy water to make him greatly injured. He even made his resistance to holy objects almost negligible and hence further increasing the pain. And to make sure that Diodora didn't leave his mansion or throw away his stuff, he made all of them soul-bound, making them unable to be apart. Tatsuya also placed a genjutsu on him, making him dream of him being raped by various militants and men wearing nun outfits so that he doesn't try to harm any other nuns whenever he tried to sleep. And to further increase his suffering, he made sure to make his dick only to get an erection once a month. Why once a month? Simple. Tatsuya was being evil towards Diodora, not cruel, and having no erection till the next time he meets him will be simply cruel. Though he wanted to kill him on the spot but decided against it, as making him suffer would be better than giving him a painless death. After doing that, he noticed that the prosthetic arm that he was going to use was also there in the room, and he placed some magic stones filled with holy and corruption magic in it and hid their presence. Tatsuya could easily send the evidence of him being the one for banishment of nuns by sending a copy of his speech to Michael, but he knew that Michael would not do anything, as there was a risk of going on a war with devils, and them being without their god would mean a great disadvantage on their side. After all that was done, Tatsuya came back and from then on started the training of his teammates once again, with Asia being a new addition. Tatsuya decided to make all of them reach at least high tier ultimate class before the beginning of the plot, and now they all had roughly 2 years for that. He intensified their training and studies, making them just barely being able to keep up with all that. The biggest hurdle for him was to make Asia able to hurt humans, and for that he started by making her kill ants, and even that made Asia cry or faint in the beginning. Slowly and slow she overcome all that and started training her body and magic accordingly. She was even trained to use her sacred gear properly and is now able to use distant healing with only a bit of efficiency loss. She is also able to use the negative aspect of healing magic, making her attacks more deadly as they are able to cause great amounts of internal damage. Her strength and magic capabilities increased as well, and now she is able to go toe-to-toe with Shizuka using pure strength and is able to use all basic elements up to a level. She was also able to use ki but not chakra. She can use her ki for flight and strengthening her body and ki orbs, making her a perfect healing nuke. Tatsuya also started to make others have a combination attacks but didn't told them the way to do it. They were made to make their own combination attacks, and Tatsuya had to seriously admit that they came up with unique and strong combinations. Tatsuya has given both Asia and Shizuka some energy conduction gloves which make the flow of any kind of energy to their fists easier, making them the best equipment for battle. Tatsuya also make them spar with each other and also let them hunt stray devils, fallen angels, and exorcists from time to time, and Tatsuya and the others were surprised to see that Asia was able to kill not only devils and fallen angels but also the exorcists who once worked for the church. Everything has been going well and all according to his schedule. His team's strength is also remarkable. They all combined were able to take on Kurumi in her human form and even forced her to remain serious all the time. Thought there was no visible damage on her, their progress was still amazing. Like this 2 years passed by and everyone in the team has started to look more mature. All of their growths have just been like Tatsuya planned, with all of them being at the high tier ultimate class and just being at bottleneck of their breakthroughs, with the exception of Ingvild and Kurumi, both of them being at the low and high tier of Satan class respectively. And while Kurumi is in her tailed beast form, she is at mid-tier super class. Seeing their growth, Tatsuya is very happy as there is now only a few people who can pose any danger to them. Tatsuya looked at his team and smiled and thought, so the plot finally begins. Hey! Chapter 72, Misunderstand. Kyoa Academy is a prestigious girls-only academy which recently adopted CO education. Most of the teachers in this academy are quite exceptional and is regarded to have one of the best faculty in the entire country. Many students come here in order to fulfill their future ambitions by making good use of all the facilities provided in the academy, but still there is quite a lot of people who can make the perfect atmosphere around the academy quite disgusting. Right now in front of the Kyoa Academy gates, 2 girls with black hair wearing spectacles were standing and greeting everyone that was coming through the gates. They call ya be called beautiful. Even among all the girls that were present around them, they stood out a lot. Though most of the boys that were coming through the gates were looking at them with leech rouse eyes, they were not affected by them and only shot a glare at them, making them look away. Most of the older students were already habitual to this habit and were not bothered by it. They both were a sign admired by all the girls of the academy, as they were the new student council president and vice president, Sana Shidori and Tsubaki Shinra respectively. They both were standing in front of the gate and were welcoming all the new students coming there and telling them directions and helping them. Suddenly all the girls and boys started making uproar while shouting, "Onee-sama!" Seeing the commotion that the students were creating, Sana sighed and thought, here we go again. She then turned around and said, "Good morning, Rias, Akeno." A girl with crimson hair left freely and a voluptuous body wearing Kyoa Academy's uniform was standing in front of Sana. The girl had smooth and white skin tone and bluish-green eyes. She was regarded as the #1 beauty in the school and was given the title of Oni-sama by the students. She was none other than the younger sister of Cisco Kogjamu Surtsk's Lucifer. Accompanying her was another beautiful girl with black hair tied in a ponytail with a body which was even more erotic than Rias. She too was wearing Kyoa Academy's uniform and had violet eyes and fair skin. She was regarded as the second best beauty of the academy and shared the title of Oni-sama along with Rias, making them regarded as the 2 great Oni-samas of the academy. Rias smiled at her childhood friend and said, "Good morning, Sana, Tsubaki. Looks like both of you are working very hard from this early in the morning, so we decided to help you out a bit." Sana, who heard her, adjusted her glasses and said, "I really appreciate your concern, but it is my duty as the student council president to work so diligently in the morning and help the new students who just joined us." Tsubaki then smirked and said, "Oh, then you mean to say that you are not waiting for him to show up, student council president?" At her words Sana got stiff and then blushed. Seeing her blush, Rias smiled and said, "Oh, Sana has a crush on someone, now that's news to me." Akeno covered her mouth with her hand and said, Ara, looks like President's youth has begun as well." Sana's blush then deepened and it looked like steam was coming out of her head. She then calmed herself and then again got back into his president mode and stood in front of her friends with an expressionless face. She looked at the others and said, "There is no one like that." Just as she said that, she heard a voice which made her to become stiff again. Tatsuya and the others were walking towards their new school and all of them looked very excited to go to school after a long time. Tatsuya looked at all the girls and saw them look very happy. Tatsuya admired their beauty for a while and then said, "You all look beautiful in the uniform." The girls who heard him blushed and smiled. They all felt happy that the guy they liked complimented them. They were also looking at Tatsuya intently and thought, "This guy is too good and handsome. We have to protect them from all those hungry girls at the school." Suddenly Miyuki sighed and said, "If only I was the same age as Oni-sama, then I would have a chance to study in same class as him." As she said that, Himari jumped on Tatsuya's back and said, "Yes, so while you would be away I will enjoy with Tatsuya a lot." Hearing her, all the girls who were in first year glared at her but sighed as they knew that they could not do anything about that. Suddenly Tatsuya's hands were wrapped by Asia and Kagura. Asia looked at Tatsuya and said, I am looking forward to study along with you and I will enjoy school along with you as well. Tatsuya looked at her and thought, wow, Asia have become much more bolder than before. His face was then turned by Kagura, who looked at him with a blush and said shyly, I as well look forward to study with you. Tatsuya, who saw her blushing face, was taken aback and thought, so cute. Tatsuya could have sworn that if Asia and Himari were not latching onto him, then he would have surely hugged her. Seeing the 4 second years flirting with each other, the first years in the group started complaining and said, hey, why can't we study with you guys? We are technically older than most of the current first year students because of training in that time chamber of yours. Tatsuya freed himself and then turned around and said, yes, you are technically older than your peers, but don't forget, according to your documents you are still younger than us. Hearing his explanation, all of them started groaning in annoyance but knew that they couldn't do anything. Seeing their condition, Himari started to mock Miyuki, making both of them argue with each other along the whole way. Soon the school came into their view and then Tatsuya noticed Sana and Tsubaki standing there with 2 other girls, whom he recognized by seeing their features. He then raised his hand and said, good morning Sotan, how have you been? Seeing Tatsuya act like that, all the girls with him sighed and thought, here we go again. Sana, who heard his voice calling her by her nickname, made her very embarrassed. Seeing her condition, Tsubaki smiled and said, and here is the one we have been waiting for. Sana, who was still embarrassed, didn't wait for long and then immediately walked towards Tatsuya and said, you don't call me by my nickname here and don't act too friendly with me. I am the student council president and you being overly friendly with me will make it look like I am favoring you. Tatsuya, who heard her, acted to be hurt by her words and said, how can you say such cruel words, Sana? Even after we spent all that time together in my room along with the others, you played chess with me for all this time and now you are asking me to act like I don't know you. That's too cruel. With each and every word that he said, the look on her and the other students' face changed greatly. Sana kept on getting redder and redder because of embarrassment, and the student body got shocked that their president would act like that. Rias was also quite surprised by all this and Akino was only doing her era. Meanwhile, when all of this was happening, Tatsuya's team and Tsubaki were trying very hard to control their laughter. They were quite amused by seeing the look on Sana's face, and Tsubaki and Tatsuya decided to take a picture of her at that time. Just as the photo was clicked, Sana came out of her stupor and shouted, don't say things that the others will surely misunderstand. Chapter 73, Meeting the Dragon. After Tatsuya and the others cleared the misunderstanding, Tatsuya and his went towards the gate. At the gate, Tatsuya looked at Tsubaki and smiled at her and said, good morning Tsubaki, it's been a long time since the last time we met. I hope that you take care of me while I will be in school. Tsubaki, who looked at his smiling face, blushed a bit and said, why, yeah, it's been a long time, and if you find any problem regarding the academy, make sure to come to me. Tatsuya nodded his head and then went inside the school without bothering to talk with anyone. The girls who were left behind were talking with Sana and Tsubaki. Himari came close to Tsubaki and asked, we know that Sana is bound to her chess bet, but why haven't you proposed to Tatsuya yet? You like him as well, right? Tsubaki, who heard her, blushed and said in a low voice, is it that obvious? The others looked at her with a deadpan look and said, are you serious? I can bet that even the guy himself knows that you like him but is not saying anything to make you feel awkward. Tsubaki's blush intensified and she said, I will propose him once he beats Sana, or she will feel bad. Sana, who heard her, placed her hand on Tsubaki's shoulder and said, Tsubaki, I didn't know that you were such a good friend. You know what, just ask me anything and I will try my best to do it. Tsubaki looked at her and said, then just lose to him already. How many years are you planning to have your chess date for? And the reason why I decided to propose to him after you is because, if you were to know that I was in a relationship with him, you would have increased my workload. So just hurry up and lose. Sana, who heard her queen's words, was twitching her lips, but she had to admit that she too wanted to be in a relationship with him as soon as possible, but still she was not going to lose on purpose. Sana fixed her glasses and said, there is no way that I am going to lose to him on purpose. I accept that I like him, but I will still not forfeit without having a serious match. Tsubaki looked at her king for a while and then sighed and said, you know, you looked kind of cool there, but that still doesn't solve your problem. And did you notice that you finally accepted that you like him? Sana, who heard her, blushed immediately, but then suddenly all of them stiffened when they heard a voice. Yeah, both of you took a very long time to finally say that you know. Tatsuya said, looking at all of them while sitting on the wall of the school. Tatsuya then smiled and said, the school is about to start, so I came to call all of you, but I didn't expect to hear such a discussion. He then looked at his team and said, let's go. His team nodded their head and all of them looked at Sana and Tsubaki and said, good luck to both of you. And then left. On the side, Rias and Akeno were looking at their friends with an amused expression, and they both were all intrigued by Tatsuya, as he didn't even bat an eye to both of them. Rias looked at Sana once again and thought, there is something about that boy Tatsuya, does he possesses a sacred gear? Well, let's do some spying and find the truth about him. Also, the girls that came with him also seem to be something. Looks like I am going to get a ton of new peerage members. She looked at Akeno and said, find some information about all of them. Akeno places her hand on her cheek and said, oh, I get to spy on a handsome guy, how lucky I am. And licked her lips. Ria sighed on seeing Akeno's antics and then called Sana and Tsubaki to go back to the classes. Tatsuya, who was walking towards his class in between the uproar caused by the girls who were being all kyaa on seeing him, heard Rias's thoughts through his telepathy and muttered, try all you want, princess. And kept walking towards the class. Along the way he made everyone clear to not mess with either him or his team, especially the boys who were lusting after the girls. His one glare made them all stiffen up and drench in cold sweat. Tatsuya then entered his class and noticed that all the second years of his team were in his class as well. Tatsuya also noticed that he was in Issei's class after he found 3 guys sitting together and the girls having a good distance away from them. Tatsuya looked at his girls and said, try to maintain as much distance as possible from those 3 pervs. The girls looked at the 3 of them and nodded their heads after seeing that they were openly reading an adult magazine. Tatsuya then took the protagonist's seat and opened the window to let the breeze come in. The wind coming inside made his hair flutter a bit, adding to his charm, making all the girls and even some of the boys to blush. But still most of the boys who saw that clicked their tongues and said, damn, we got another kaiba here. We don't need any more guys, we just need more cute girls. Hey, but don't you think that the girls who came with him were all hot and cute? Yes, some of them had big tits as well. As Tatsuya heard them, he started to release some killing intent on those boys while he kept smiling. The boys who felt the killing intent started to sweat and got scared. They all looked at him, and once they saw his smiling face they all immediately froze up. Tatsuya looked at them still smiling. He then raised his hand, moved it towards his neck and then motioned his thumb to be slashing his neck. All of the boys nodded their heads and looked towards the board. Tatsuya stopped releasing his killing intent, making all of them take a deep breath simultaneously. All the girls who saw that were beyond amazed that he was able to control all the pervs in the class with ease and decided to give him the title of the King of Kuaha, about which Tatsuya didn't even give a fuck. Soon the teacher came to the class and after introducing themselves the classes begun. Soon after the classes began, the while Tatsuya team was beyond bored. They all had already studied all that they will be taught because of the grace of Tatsuya. They all soon stopped listening to the teacher and started to talk to each other through the mental links that he had created for his team. Tatsuya used his telepathy and decided to hear other people's thoughts and was very disappointed that most of the boys in the class were actually fantasizing about something perverted rather than studying. The most he was annoyed was with issei, who was thinking about swimming in the sea of boobs while shouting "Oppai." Tatsuya sighed, but then he felt a presence inside issei. He concentrated on it and knew that it was his sacred gear. He concentrated even more and soon entered inside the sacred gear's core and saw a land covered with flames. He then looked around and saw a huge red dragon sleeping there. He then walked towards the dragon and said, "You hop, you awake." The dragon grunted in displeasure but still didn't open his eyes. Seeing that, Tatsuya smiled maliciously and then used his magic to make Drake dream about him being fucked by Albion. Soon Drake woke up in cold sweat and shouted, "No Albion, you cannot do that, and even if you want to I will be the dominating one, as I am the dragon of domination, not you." Tatsuya looked at him with a sweat drop and said, "Bro, seriously?" Drake, who heard the voice, looked at Tatsuya and he wanted to explain himself but thought that it would only make matters worse. There was an awkward silence there and Drake decided to break the silence and said, "Who are you, human? Are you my new host?" Tatsuya shook his head and said, "No, I am not your host, I am just currently looking inside the sacred gear." Drake, who heard him, widened his eyes in surprise and said, "You know me?" Tatsuya nodded and said, "Yeah, Albion told me about you once." Drake was even more shocked and asked, "How do you know Albion? Are you his host?" Tatsuya again shook his head and said, Albion's host is my friend and we have fought quite a few times, so in a sense you can say that I am Albion's friend. Oh, by the way, I am Tatsuya, nice to meet you. Drake nodded his head and said, yeah, nice to meet you as well, I am Drake, the heavenly dragon of domination. Tatsuya then laughed and said, yeah, I heard just now when you want to dominate Albion in bed. Drake, who heard him, immediately glared at Tatsuya and said, that's all happened because I had a nightmare. Tatsuya and Drake then began to talk to each other and Drake started telling him his adventures with his previous hosts and his life when he was alive. Soon a realization hit Drake and he asked, by the way, do you know who my host is and how strong is he? Tatsuya, who heard him, nodded his head and said, yeah, your host is the biggest pervert ever born, even more perverted than Azazel, and about his strength it would be better that you didn't ask. Drake, who heard him, looked at Tatsuya and said, hey, he cannot be that bad. Tatsuya looked at him and said, he has been dreaming of swimming in a sea of tits while shouting op high since before the time we started to talk to each other and is still dreaming about that. Hearing him, Drake didn't know what to say and kept his mouth shut. Chapter 74, Knight and Cat. After a while Drake calmed down and they again started to talk to each other. Soon the bell rang announcing that the break had begun. Tatsuya looked at Drake and said, well Drake, let's talk later, I would have to leave for now. Drake also stood up and said, see you later my new friend, and let's have a spar the next time you come. It has been a long time since I met someone and by how you described my current host it does not look like he would be able to awaken my power anytime soon. Tatsuya only gave him a helpless smile and then left the Sacred Gears Corps. He then came back to consciousness and saw that the teacher was leaving the classroom. He then stood up and was about to ask the others where to go to have their lunch, but before he was able to, he was suddenly surrounded by a lot of girls who started to ask him various questions. The other girls of his team who saw this sighed as they knew that this will happen. Tatsuya gave them a helpless smile and gave them a telepathic message to find a place and he would come later. Tatsuya then talked to the girls for a while and tried to answer most of the questions as possible. Soon he started to get a bit annoyed by them and decided to take shelter inside the men's restroom. Inside the restroom he met another person who seemed to have been experiencing from the same conditions as him. The boy looked at Tatsuya and gave him a helpless smile, to which Tatsuya replied with one as well. The boy who was with Tatsuya inside the restroom was also known to him. The boy was handsome and had short blonde hair complemented with his fair skin. He had a small mole under his left eye and his eyes were bluish-gray. Tatsuya had seen this guy countless times in the anime and he had to admit that he lived up to the reputation of being called the Prince of Kuaha. He was none other than Kaiba Yuto, the Knight of Rias Gremory. Both of them introduces themselves and talk to each other for a while. Kaiba also taught Tatsuya ways to evade most situations when the girls trouble him, to which he was very grateful. Meeting a person who have similar trouble as him made Kaiba feel a bit of companionship with him and they quickly became friends. Tatsuya was happy as well because he had only few male friends and having one who is not perverted in a school full of perverts was a perk in itself. They soon left the bathroom together and walked in the corridor talking to each other. Most of the girls who saw them interacting with each other started to make weird fantasies about both of them, making both of them feel uncomfortable hearing to their comments. Tatsuya and Kaiba then exchanged contact information and soon both of them parted ways. Kaiba was going to the occult research club and Tatsuya was going to the rooftop where he felt that others were. Tatsuya opened the gate of the rooftop and saw all of them sitting there talking to each other, but they were not alone. To his surprise, there was also a wit-haired loli whom he recognized. The girl as mentioned was a cute loli with white hair and golden eyes. She looked quite frail and weak and gave the feeling of wanting to protect her, but she was quite a hard hitter, packing some immense brute strength and can pummel any human she wants. She liked sweets and hated perverts a lot. She was Konako Tojo, or Chiron as called by her elder sister Kurika. Tatsuya approached them and greeted all of them. He then looked at Konako and Miyuki who was sitting by her side, said, "Ani-sama, meet Konako-chan, the new friend that we made today. She even beat all the perverts in the class for us." Tatsuya looked at her with a smile and said, "I am Tatsuya Shiba, nice to meet you. And I am very grateful that you helped my girls against perverts." Konako nodded her head and said emotionlessly, "Nice to meet you as well, I am Konako Tojo. I heard a lot about you from these four, in fact I only heard about you from them." Tatsuya looked at them who looked away in embarrassment except Miyuki who was puffing her chest and looked proud. All the others around her looked at her with sweat drop and decided to ignore it. Tatsuya then sat down and started to have lunch with them as well. Soon Himari and the others took out their desserts and placed it in between. Seeing the sweets in front of her, Konako's eyes brightened up. Tatsuya looked at her and chuckled, making her look away with a blush. Tatsuya then smiled and said, sorry, you can have one as well, Konako-chan. Accept it as my apology. Konako, who heard him, gave a small smile and moved her hand towards the dessert, but before she was able to grab the one she wanted, it disappeared from its spot, making her widen her eyes in surprise and others sighing. Tatsuya was then seen standing with a coffee jelly in his hand and he said, sorry Konako-chan, but coffee jelly is always mine, you can have something else, and started eating it. Konako, who saw the sudden change in Tatsuya's behavior, was beyond shocked. She then looked at others while pointing her finger at Tatsuya and asked, is he always like that? To which they all replied, only when it comes to coffee jelly. Konako was looking at him weirdly, and Tatsuya, who saw her expression, sighed and then scooped out some coffee jelly and put the spoon in her mouth and said, it's only the first and last time, don't expect me to share it from now on, and started eating again. All of them who saw him do that was shocked. Konako, who just ate the coffee jelly, put her hands on her lips and muttered while blushing, it was an indirect kiss. It was an indirect kiss. It was an indirect kiss. The others looked at Konako with a shocked expression and all of them shouted at once, Onii-sama, Tatsuya-san shared his coffee jelly. As soon as they shouted that, they all heard Kurumi's and Shizuka's voice over the telepathic link, which said, Wayot. Konako looked at the girls weirdly and said with her cold expression, you all are shocked about that. Chapter 75, Yuri Harem. After that day his school life went forward. Every day he would enter the class amongst the uproar caused by the girls and then went talk and spar with Drake inside his sacred gear. And during their spar Drake was easily beaten by him. Though he still didn't showed him his true power. Because of the spars between him and Drake, there were occasional bursts of energy which had alerted the two devil heirs about Issei's sacred gear. After that he would spend his break either with Kaiba or his girls and Konako. He also spars with Kaiba sometimes in the kendo hall and easily overwhelms him, making Rias take more and more interest in him. Tatsuya also noticed that Akeno had already started stalking him, and it was too hard for him to control his girls to not take care of her and explain them what she was doing. Though they were displeased on being stalked, they still decided to follow his instructions and didn't mess with Rias and her group, and Konako was their friend as well. Konako has also approved of him being near him and did not act too cold in his presence. Seeing this, many of her male admirers also tried to get close to her, only to be instantly shot down because of them being a pervert. Tatsuya also handled the pervert trio after they tried to peep in the changing room in which Miyuki and the others were changing, and implanted fear in their hearts. Though they still tried peek around the rooms where none of Tatsuya's acquaintance were present. During all this time Rias tried to approach him, only to be blocked by the girls of his team. Tatsuya also felt the presence of many fallen angels in the town, but decided to keep quiet about it as he was not responsible for the town and it was the work of the devil heirs. But from this he came to know that the events would be beginning soon. Today is their long-awaited weekend, and right now Tatsuya is working inside his restaurant, and suddenly the door opened and the customers who came were his acquaintance. Tatsuya looked towards his customers and said, "Oh, Sotan and Tsubaki. Nice meeting you on the weekend." Sana, who heard him call her by his nickname, blushed and said, "Tatsuya, as I remember I told you not to call me by my nick." But before she was able to finish, Tatsuya interjected her and said, I remember what you told me. You told me not to call you by your nickname in school, and by any way I look at it, we are not in school. Right so? Tan. Sana, who heard his reasoning, blushed even harder but was not able to retort. She grumbled for a bit and then went ahead to take her seat. Along with her many more girls with her as well. Tatsuya looked at them and then at Tsubaki and asked, "And they are?" Tsubaki, who heard his question, pointed at the girls and said, "Oh, they are the new student council members. We came here to celebrate their joining the peerage." The girls who heard Tsubaki telling Tatsuya about joining Sana's peerage were shocked and whispered, "Is it all right, Vice President telling him about devils?" Tatsuya looked at them and smiled and said, "You don't have to worry about that. I know about the supernatural world from a long time, and I also know that she is the Citri heiress." After that all of them introduced themselves to him and he did the same. He then eyed each of them and thought, "So Saji has not joined yet, hey?" Tsubaki, who saw him looking at each of the girls there, pouted a bit and asked, "What are you thinking, Tatsuya?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "Nothing, just thinking that these are the new members of Sana's Yuri harem, that's all." Hearing his words, all of the team members other than Tsubaki got surprised and asked, Do you mean Sana-sama is into girls? Tatsuya, who saw them taking the bait, internally smirked and said, yes, don't you know, she is a massive pervert who plays around with girls from time to time. In fact, she has not even left her older sister, and she even have her fun with her from time to time at my home, and she told me that she will make her peerage as a harem. The girls who heard him got shocked, but they were still a bit doubtful of him. Then Momo Hanakai, a girl with a beautiful face and white hair, came forward and said, how do you expect us to believe that? President is not like that. Tatsuya looked at her and said, you don't have to believe me, but just think about it, all the members of her team is a girl, beautiful no less, and she doesn't even show any interest in boys as well and spends all the times with girls. The girls who heard Tatsuya's words were starting to feel that he was indeed saying the truth and all the things he said were true. Tsubaki, who was standing behind the others, was trying very hard to not burst out laughing. Suddenly a hand was placed in Tatsuya's shoulder and he turned his head and saw Sana looking at him, and it seemed that some black miasma was leaking out of her body. She looked at Tatsuya in the eyes and said, what are telling me about me, Tatsuya? Do you want me to kill you? Tatsuya looked at her peerage and said, see, she is now trying to threaten me as I exposed her plan. Oh Sotan, how nasty have you become? Sana, who heard him, was about to lash out at him but stopped when she noticed her peerage look at her. She then looked at her peerage and was about to explain, but then all of them bowed to her and said, sorry President, even though we admire you, it is not to the point to have feelings for you, so we are sorry, but we cannot be in a relationship with you. As soon as they said that, both Tatsuya and Tsubaki burst out laughing and said, oh my Sana, looks like you were rejected even before you could have proposed, so sad. And continued to laugh. Meanwhile Sana was blushing from embarrassment as all the others were looking at her with pity and were saying things like, poor child and all. Sana, who had enough of all that, shouted, there is no such thing like that.
That is all for today. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. If you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please drop a comment down below.